Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by Sean Chapman
and Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to step into the Grand Tour, the Grand Tour, the Grand Tour. That's right, we're stepping once more into the Grand Tour of anime. This week on the show, we are at our penultimate stop on our Grand Tour of anime, but our penultimate stop is for the ultimate in dark fantasy anime. That's right, this is one of our most requested topics in the history of us doing podcasting since well before Japanimation Station, and we are finally today discussing the granddaddy of everything from Final Fantasy VII all the way down to Dark Souls, from Claymore to Attack on Titan. We are today discussing Berserk, or more specifically Kenpu Denki Berserk, the 1997 TV anime adaptation of the all-time classic manga, a topic I've been very excited to eventually discuss since I read the manga a very, very long time ago, but had never seen the anime till today. But Jonathan, this was your choice for one of our stops on the Grand Tour, so why don't you introduce why are we here and what are we doing?
Yes, well, basically, I watched this show, Kenpu Denki Berserk. We'll talk about the title later, but the 1997 Berserk adaptation when Discotek put out their Blu-ray in, I believe, 2023, which was the North American release of the show on Blu-ray, the first time it had been in official circulation in the US in a number of years. You could have always gone and pirated it, but I saw that, I'm like, I've always wanted to get into Berserk. The manga is obviously very big. The 97 anime is very acclaimed, and I thought, I'll just watch that anime, see if I'm into it. I was very into it. I said at the time, I thought it was one of the 5 or 10 best anime I had ever seen. I stand by that. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. I have since read up through everything the anime covers in the manga, through to basically the beginning. I've read through Golden Age into some of the Conviction arc stuff. And that's where I am right now, just so people know with the manga. And then, of course, I watched the anime again for this. I still think it is one of the most interesting and accomplished adaptations of anything I've ever seen, and particularly after reading the manga, it, if anything, became more interesting to me what it's doing. And I just think the show is a masterwork, and so when we were putting our grand tour together, this was like my first choice, like we're putting that on the list, and you wanted to do it too because you had not seen the show and wanted an excuse to watch it, so that's why we are doing it. But Sean, you're the one who's new to the anime at least, so what did you think of it? I'm curious.
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic. So for with just briefly on my history with Berserk, I read the manga a long time ago. It's probably been 12 or 13 years because I read it before learning any Japanese. So this was like us living in the condo and me just reading it for the English translations. And I loved it. I just absorbed it so quickly. It's a very, very long manga, but it's so well structured that you just it's very hard to put down. So I remember just voraciously reading through that and then getting up to the point where it had at that point finished. We'll obviously talk about eventually when Miura the mangaka passes away and that kind of stuff. We'll hit on that in the history section. But basically by the point I had caught up was a very kind of good spot to stop and leave it off. And I walked away from the manga at that point and then have not gone back to it since, though I've reread through the beginning now that we are watching this show. But I have not gotten very far in my reread yet. But I had not seen any of the anime adaptations. There are multiple. We'll discuss those briefly and why we're not doing those other ones. But this obviously has had a huge reputation for a very long time. And I just never found a good opportunity to go and watch it. And yeah, so finally getting to do it for the podcast was fun, and it's amazing. I mean, one, the Discotheque release, which we both have, is just killer. Like, it's such a good-looking set, and it's just a very, very nice... I mean, it's such a gorgeous-looking show that you wanted to have it in such a nice format. And I was very curious to watch it just to see how do you put together a single show that is covering this one part of Berserk that is basically a very, very long extended flashback, but also in flashbacks maybe almost an inappropriate term for it just because of how long it is, but it takes place in the past from where the story began. But it's also so long that a 25 episode season can't actually even cover the extent of the entirety of that kind of quote unquote flashback arc. So I was very curious to get to this and see how do you put together a show that is about the build up to the kind of hell world that Guts and all the characters live in the current day. And how do you kind of build that into a context that makes sense on its own and all that? And I think that the show just is phenomenal top to bottom, especially at doing that, at making it feel like it's a complete version of itself, even if it obviously ends without a sort of like ultimate sense of resolution, even though obviously the manga does not have, and maybe will never have, depending on how things go, a true ultimate sense of resolution. But it stops at the sort of like genesis moment for the rest of the series of Berserk, but it is able to make that feel like it is a powerful climax of the specific story that this show is trying to tell, the specific character arcs that it is interested in. And I think it's just a really, really sharply written show. It's got just gorgeous art. I think the way that it handles Miura's artwork is perfect, which is, I think, a huge challenge for any adaptation of this, because his art is so detailed that you have to find some way to communicate that in anime, and find ways to get it to move enough for it to work, but you also can't get it all to move because it's too detailed. There's just so many challenges that this show has in front of it, and I think every single challenge it overcomes and just is ultimately such a fantastic adaptation of this section of the manga. It is like such a great companion piece to the manga as well, of just being able to flesh out some of those moments with a soundtrack, with this different kind of art, with the voice acting, all of that, for a story that I love so much and a manga that I love so much. Getting to see this adaptation of it was really, really awesome.
Yeah, so I am glad we are on the same page on this one. I assumed we would be because we have similar taste and this show is phenomenal. And, I do want to recommend if you're someone who has not gotten into Berserk, and you are maybe intimidated by the size and scale of the manga, and, if you like owning physical copies, the number of books you would have to buy, this show is a great starting point. It is, I think you can watch this completely clean. I knew nothing. It works 100%, and it'll, probably make you want to go read more. But again, I agree with Sean that I do think this show is complete unto itself. You could... it's been 30 years. It would be weird to make a season 2 of this show now. You could, though. You could continue. It's not like it forecloses further Berserk adaptations from this version, but I do think it is complete unto itself. I do, before we go forward, want to do something unusual for this show and just give a brief content warning that this episode, because of what we are talking about, is going to include discussions of sexual violence that occur in the text of Berserk, including child abuse and sexual assault, and how those moments are thematized within the narrative. So if you've never read or watched Berserk, please do be warned that this is part of the story. If you're not in the headspace to listen to this conversation today, totally understand that. As always, the first half of today's episode is going to focus on the history, production, and creative talent behind the show, and then we will get into those deeper plot and theme discussions after the Eyecatch break. So do just keep that in mind as we talk about Berserk, because there's some heavy stuff going on in this world.
Yes, absolutely. Like it is the granddaddy of dark fantasy, or modern dark fantasy, in a lot of ways, and this is one of them. Though I think most of the things inspired by Berserk do not approach this subject in the same way that Berserk typically does. But yes, obviously this is going to be a thing that we're going to have to talk about a lot with this episode.
So a quick note on the title, too, that this show is just called Berserk, and usually Berserk 97 in Western fandom, but its title in Japanese is Kenpu Denki Berserk. That is not the title of the manga. The manga is just Berserk. You could translate that title in a few different ways. Denki is the word for fantasy fiction, but also for romance. It's also the den is the same root as legend, densetsu. So any of those words could be used. Kenpu is just the kanji for sword and wind put together. It's not like a word that exists in the dictionary, but it basically would mean something like sword style or way of the sword, sort of as it's used in like kendo or something. It can also mean, because it is sword and wind put together, it could mean sword wind. It means both effectively in the text of Berserk, because it comes from a chapter title in the manga. So you could translate this a couple different ways. I prefer the title The Sword Wind Romance Berserk because it makes me laugh, because it sounds like a very different show than the one you're watching, and I love it. But you could also call it The Legend of the Way of the Sword Berserk or something like that. Just wanted to give a quick note on that title.
Yes, there are lots of little things like that in Berserk where there are like very kind of arbitrary ways you could translate things, where there's not like given like a lot of specific context for very like in world or in universe turns of phrase. And it's always interesting to see like how the translators approach certain things. And there were things about the Discotheque translation I found interesting in certain places, which we'll talk about as we get into the show. But yes, Kinpu Denki, a very strange combination of kanji just kind of thrown together, that would perplex any translator to be like, what do you do? Like, how would you translate that phrase? And, I think most people just kind of ignore it and just go, yeah, it's just Berserk. Yeah, I don't need to translate that.
Yes, but technically they did, they foresaw the search engine optimization hell we were all going to be living in the 2020s, and decided we will give it a unique title. This isn't Berserk, it's Kenpu Denki Berserk. And I do thank them for that. That effort's ultimately kind of in vain because no one calls it that, but that is the title.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think it is appropriate just in terms of what they've called it there. In terms of what this covers is the quote unquote romance part of it, not romance in terms of like love, though there is that element there, but romance in the traditional sense, which is like chivalric tales, because this is the like medieval version of Berserk before it fully becomes like dark fantasy. And so I think Kenpu Denki, it's a very intentional choice to call it that based on what section of the manga it's adapting, because if you called anything after this Kenpu Denki Berserk, it would be a very strange kind of appellation to go for. But yes, it is an interesting kind of choice they made with the title here.
All right, well, with that out of the way, do you want to jump into the history of Berserk, Sean?
Yes, because I think with the history of Berserk, there's a lot to cover. And I'm very glad that I was not responsible for the notes for this one, because I've done the notes for the past few. And then I was like, yes, finally, Jonathan, you get to take here's one of the most storied manga ever that has so many different adaptations. Let you do the notes on this one, please.
Yes. To be fair, we've been recording these a little out of order. For people listening, it's been going back and forth. But that's okay.
Yes.
Let's see. So history. Let's begin with the manga itself. And I want to start this the same way the video essayist Lady Emily does in her really great video essay on the adaptation history of Berserk, where she starts her video saying, at the age of 18, Miura Kentaro was fired for being too good of an artist. Now, that is a cheeky way to say it, but it is essentially true, because at age 18, Miura was hired as an assistant to Morikawa George, the iconic mangaka best known for Hajime no Ippo, although he would write that later in the decade. At the time, they were basically contemporaries. Morikawa was just a few months older, and he was working on his series Kazuya Now. Morikawa did dismiss Miura after one day on the job, after Miura showed him early sketches of a dark warrior with a gigantic, extra sword, the images that would eventually become Berserk. And Morikawa looked at that and said, I don't have anything to teach you. You're great. And he said, you should go focus on your own work. And so that is what Miura did. When Miura died, Morikawa was one of many, many, many artists to memorialize him online. On Twitter, he showed a page from Kazuya Now with a school that Morikawa drew during that very brief stint as an assistant when Miura was 18 and Morikawa was 19. And he said, he was such a bundle of talents that it sent shivers down my spine. And I think that is a great way to describe Miura Kentaro, who is, we've talked before on the show, Sean, about the word genius and where it does and does not apply. Miura Kentaro was a genius. He is someone who came out of the gate a once-in-a-generation talent. He basically speed-ran his way to success. He created a manga called Miu Ranger at the age of 10 for his classmates in a school publication, which he wrote 40 volumes of, although they say in Japanese it's 40 maki, which is a kanji that could mean chapter or volume or installments, depending on how you're using it. So who knows? This was a manga written for classmates when he was 10, but he wrote a lot of it, is the point.
Yeah.
His second manga, which he began the next year at age 11, was Kene no Michi, or The Way to the Sword. He continued working throughout school and specialized in an arts curriculum in high school, where he befriended a man named Mori, or a boy at the time, Mori Koji. He and Mori submitted a sci-fi manga to Weekly Shonen Sunday, which lost in the final round of selections. And again, this was when they were in high school. But the two of them stayed friends for life, to the point that when Miura passed away, Mori is the one who took over the writing for Berserk, alongside Miura's assistants and at his studio, Studio Gaga. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. After leaving Morikawa George, the artist of Hajime no Ippo, Miura then applied to the art college at Nihon University in 1985. His admissions project was a manga titled Futatabi, or Once More. It not only got him into the school, but won him the 34th Newcomer Manga Award from Weekly Shonen Magazine. And as his time at the university would have been drawing to a close, Miura collaborated with the author Buron-san, that is his pen name, who is the writer of Fist of the North Star, which Miura has often claimed as a major inspiration on Berserk, and they worked together on a single-volume manga called King of Wolves, which published from May to July 1989, and that was published in Hakusensha's monthly Animal House magazine. While he was working on that project, the previous year, he had also published a 48-page prototype version of what would become Berserk in Hakusensha's monthly Kami Kami magazine. That 1988 prototype was later included in volume 14 of Berserk after the end of the Golden Age arc, so if you want to read it, it does exist. It's interesting to see his much more... because his art evolves so much from the beginning of Berserk to the end of the Golden Age. You go back to something he wrote before any of it, and there's less detail in it, but it still has that same kind of strength and just incredible physicality to it. It is interesting to look at, and I'm glad it's there in that volume. But all of this led to the beginning of the full serialization of Berserk, which began in monthly Animal House in August of 1989, 1 month after the end of King of Wolves. This magazine was later rechristened to Young Animal in 1992, where it transitioned to a twice-a-month magazine. So if you're wondering why the chapter length for Berserk is so weird at the beginning, because the first chapter is 60 pages, then the second chapter is 150, and it's kind of all over the place until once the Animal House version starts, then it is a normal 20 to 30 pages throughout the rest of its run, and that is why. It's because that's when Young Animal sort of standardized to become a bi-monthly magazine. So Young Animal is a seinen magazine that not only features manga, but gravure idol photos. So the cover of every issue that Berserk was ever in has an underwear model on it, and I think that is very funny.
Yes, it is always very funny when you make that discovery, this is the magazine that Berserk was in.
Yes.
So it's here's a bikini model, basically, and then somewhere, it feels like if you had, I don't know, a super hardcore comic in Sports Illustrated or something.
Yes.
It's what is this?
Yeah, it basically the cover looks like the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition, if that's
exactly, yes.
your counterpoint in the United States. And it's one of many ways in which I think to an outsider who doesn't know anything about Berserk, including me just a couple years ago, when Miura died, it's easy to think that it's kind of this edgelord, for teens. Oh, there's a lot of sex and violence and stuff. And technically there is, but it is such a more mature adult, I don't know how you would say it, accomplished series than what you would expect going in from where it publishes, how it's kind of positioned by some publishers, the way Dark Horse's translation is very good, but if you look at the back of their volumes, the way they describe the manga is hilarious because it's just not what Berserk is. But anyway, I just think that's fun.
Yeah, it's on paper, Berserk is all of those things, and yet when you read it and get into it, there is It so goes beyond those kind of trappings it has of dude with big sword and cape and a fucking cannon arm fighting demons. Sounds like the most schlocky thing in the world.
Yes.
And Berserk is those things, and it does have a lot of the pleasures that kind of more schlocky version has, and yet there is so much more to it that it's kind of a Trojan horse of a series in many ways.
I think that's a good way to describe it. And, Berserk was not a runaway hit right away, I think in part because it is a weird blend of things. The Black Swordsman arc, which begins the series, has some of those trappings, but it also has a sobriety to it where it can really take you aback. But Berserk finally did explode in popularity during the Golden Age arc, which begins in volume 3 of the manga, around the time the magazine rebranded as Young Animal, and it has been a huge success ever since. It has over 60 million copies in circulation worldwide as of the most recent sales data from 2023. This would make it roughly the 38th best-selling manga of all time, competing with, like, it's in the same bracket as series like Haikyuu, Ranma 1/2, The Prince of Tennis, Initial D, just to give you an idea of what else is there kind of in that bracket with the series. And again, for a series that is, like, it could be so much more niche than it is, I think it tells you just what a special thing Berserk is, that it has sold as much as it has.
Yeah, because all those other things you're listing there are very all ages kind of manga, whereas Berserk is very much an adult manga. Like, it is not for younger readers. And so, yeah, it's impressive for it to be able to sell that much when it has a much more kind of restricted audience that it can sell to.
Yeah. So Miura has stated that his influences on Berserk included Fist of the North Star, the works and art style of our boy Yasuhiko Yoshikazu, the character designer on Gundam, and many, many other things, and mangaka in his own right. The manga Violence Jack by Nagai Go, the Guin Saga by Kurimoto Kaoru, and because everything is connected, he also said his favorite manga series was Tezuka Osamu's Dororo, which I think is very obvious when you put the two mangas side by side. I even said this on our Dororo episode before I had done this research, going, this must have influenced Berserk, because the whole idea of Guts having a false limb and being hunted by demons every night, that is the premise of Dororo. I mean, he has more than one false limb, and it's a different kind of demon, but it is the same kind of thing, right? So you can see that. And you also
have Puck right from the beginning of the manga, who is very much your Dororo kind of comic relief character, who gives you this much more kind of like innocent-eyed look on the main character to contrast him. Like, yes, the setup for Berserk is very clearly pulling from Dororo.
Yeah. So this, and again, we didn't plan all these connections when we started this season, but it's been fun to see them all happen. So another fun inspiration, and here's where we have to bring in a translator's note because it'll affect our terminology in this episode. The Taka no Dan, which is the group that Griffith starts that Guts joins, would be called the Band of the Falcon. That is inspired by Star Wars' Millennium Falcon, because it's a cool name. However, this was not clear for a number of years because the kanji taka means both falcon and hawk in Japanese. They are similar birds, but they are technically different birds. Thus, the translation Band of the Hawk was published or popularized in English early on. It's still used in the Dark Horse translation and the Discotek subtitles. However, Miura did eventually clarify in the text his intent because one of the later arcs is called the Millennium Falcon arc, and it has furigana over the word taka in clarifying an intended reading of falcon. So given this arc's connection to Griffith and the Taka no Dan, which he restarts at that part of the manga, it is clear that Band of the Falcon would be the preferable translation, and it is what most fans and fan groups use. It is possible that English licensors have stuck with Band of the Hawk so as not to draw attention from Star Wars lawyers. You can see this most clearly in how Dark Horse titles the Millennium Falcon arc, using the hilariously protracted Falcon of the Millennium Empire arc, which I think is the funniest fucking thing because it is it's like, how far apart can we get the words Millennium and Falcon to appease the lawyers? I love it.
Yes, like it is very funny just because, like, when you just say Millennium Falcon arc of Berserk, it does conjure to mind like a Fortnite-esque, like we put Berserk into Fortnite and he gets in a Millennium Falcon and like someone's dabbing in the background. English is just very silly. I also do think that Band of the Hawk just has a nicer rhythm to it in English. Like it feels more like the pacing of Taka no Dan, Band of the Hawk. So I personally would just stick with Band of the Hawk over going Band of the Falcon. But it is just like a very unusual connection that you just don't think Berserk and Star Wars don't really exist in the same place in my brain. So it is always funny when you see something written down as the Millennium Falcon arc of Berserk.
Yeah, I agree. Band of the Hawk sounds better. Although, again, if you were going for like fealty to the text and the author's intentions, we would say Band of the Falcon. So that's how I've written it here because I don't want to piss off Berserk fans because they might go grab a giant sword and cut me in half. I don't know. All right. So Berserk, I think it goes without saying, is the single most influential work of dark fantasy in the last 30 to 40 years. In Japan specifically, if you think about like what was fantasy in Japan in 1989, it would be much more defined by something like Dragon Quest, more whimsical and childlike and colorful, whereas Miura was much more inspired by foreign works like the 1982 Conan the Barbarian film or the Elric of Melnybones novels by British author Michael Moorcock. Japanese fantasy has been heavily inflected by Berserk ever since, perhaps most obviously in the works of Miyazaki Hidetaka and From Software. I mean, aesthetically, at least, Dark Souls is Berserk the video game. That's part of why it's great. But also, you know, Final Fantasy VII, where did Cloud get that big sword? He got it from Guts. That's where he got, like, not in a plot sense, but in a artistic sense, that is just Guts's Dragon Slayer sword.
And Sephiroth is, I think, a very clear play off of Griffith. Yes, I mean, it's all over the place in kind of any modern dark fantasy manga. I think just has very, very clear inspirations from Berserk, both in terms of writing, but especially in terms of art. Like, I just think you see the way in which Miura's art style is so influential. I think the most obvious one is if you read Claymore, which is a fantastic. If you like Berserk and you want to read another manga like that, Claymore would be a very easy go-to. But it's just one of those things where I think it opens up a certain kind of door for that more adult version of fantasy that is very kind of violent, but also like is dealing with these like kind of very heady themes about like redemption. Involves like demons and angels and hell and that kind of stuff in this very like Renaissance Catholicism kind of way. If it's just like if you want some of that Hieronymus Bosch, but it's like a modern day manga and someone's killing Bosch things with a giant sword, that's kind of like where you're going for with something like Berserk. I think it's just inescapable the degree of influence it has had, particularly on Japanese media, but then that Japanese media has influenced so much stuff in the West as well that I think really any work of dark fantasy made today bears some like homage to Berserk at somewhere in its DNA, even if the creators of that work are not aware that it does so.
Yeah, and lest it go unsaid, because I think we're just assuming everyone knows this, Berserk the manga is in the absolute highest tier of manga ever drawn. I mean, it is unbelievable. It is the art in that, you will be paging through it and you will forget the story to just look at the pictures and then have to go back and be like, what's going on? Because it is so like unbelievable. It's a kind of manga where, like many great mangaka, Miura brings you along at a very fast clip, and then I will feel guilty for not spending more time looking at the amazing drawings, and so I'll go back and it will take me forever to read through it. It is, and his talent for paneling, where he has unbelievable levels of detail, but every panel is big and clear, and you are never confused about what's going on or what to look at. He is either the best to ever do it or one of the best to ever do it, and that's all there is to it, and that is part of why the influence is so vast.
Yeah, like you can very much see his, getting a lot of influence from Hokuto no Ken or Fist of the North Star, but he also, brings such a, variety to the artwork, which always is staggering to me. Because a lot of mangaka and Fist of the North Star, which has a different writer and artist, it's an unusual manga in terms of it has a more kind of American split of the work kind of responsibilities on it. But the artist, as lots of manga artists do, kind of has 2 or 3 templates of characters and then kind of remixes I'll give this character's face a slightly different hairstyle and stuff like that. And so all the characters in Fist of the North Star are very, very similar looking. I think the thing that always is saying about Berserk, and I've just been thinking about it because I reread the first volume a couple days ago, is just how every character looks totally distinctive. Every monster looks very unique. That's that Hieronymus Bosch quality to it, where there's so much imagination, there's so much variety to what you're seeing, and all of it is realized with an incredibly exacting eye for detail, and yet you never miss the big picture of what the image is going for. He truly, when we say that he is a genius, it is both for the speed at which he came to this point in his work, but it is also just for that level of the incredible quality of it and the nature of the kind of irreplicatable nature of what he did as an artist. It's just absolutely staggering when you read through Berserk.
No mangaka I've ever read does splash pages the way he does them.
Yes.
The page turns in Berserk get you excited because you never know if you're going to turn the page and see one of the most amazing things you've ever seen that'll just break your heart. Or you'll get one of his giant 2-page spreads that basically looks like a dark fantasy Where's Waldo, where he has like 200 characters, and you're like, can I find Griffith in this panel because he has the very distinctive Falcon helmet? And like sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes that's not the point, obviously. But like, you know, especially in the Golden Age arc when he's drawing all these armies and, you know, all the horses going at each other. And he's not drawing like, you know, the idea of horses. He's drawing incredibly detailed horses with incredible muscle definition and like 100 of them for this 2-page spread. It's unbelievable.
Yes, it is just a truly staggering work when you read through the manga.
Yeah. So where does the title come from? The title Berserk is not actually substantively used in the text until the Berserker armor is introduced in chapter 222. I haven't gotten there. I don't know what that is, but it is a thing later in the manga. Yeah. Miura chose the title thinking that its mysterious aspect would stick well and that it reflected his true central image for the series, which was Guts himself. Again, he had spent years drawing versions of the character that would become Guts before he kind of found the story to put Guts in. He said, quote, "In short, starting from a world with a dark hero who is burning for revenge prompts you to imagine a rabid character. When, guided by his anger, he will pour out this rage on overpowered enemies, we must insist on his fanaticism if you want to stay consistent. That's why I thought Berserk would make a perfect title to represent my universe." And I just wanted to pause on that because I think it's cool. I think it's like, because it is, you just kind of take for granted that it's called Berserk. It's kind of a weird title, but it is such a distinctive title, and it is, for, you know, most of the series, it is a thematic thing, not anything related to plot, and I do love that about it.
Yeah. I will say so because the word Berserk does actually pop up in the first chapter.
Right, you know, it's Puck says like, he went Berserk, basically, yeah.
Yeah, well, because in the manga, as Guts walks away after he murders fucking Serpentor from G.I. Joe, which I just always love that fucking demon design, he walks away, Puck looks at him, and in Japanese, it's the kanji Kyosenshi, but it's just read as Berserk, which in English, you can't just translate that. You can't have him look at it and walk away and just go, Berserk, because it's like English doesn't work that way. But in Japanese, that like literally, he just says the word Berserk. And so it is like, I found that interesting because again, I had never read it in Japanese before, but it is just a like straight fucking title drop from Puck, literally a single balloon that just says the word Berserk in it at the very end of the first chapter.
Yeah. So Berserk published more or less regularly until about 2006, when its serialization became increasingly infrequent. It had a series of months-long hiatuses over the next 15 years, with the final chapter published in Miura's lifetime on January 22nd, 2021. Later that year, on May 20th, Hakusensha, the publisher, announced that Miura Kentaro had passed away at the age of 54 from an acute aortic dissection earlier that month. The 364th chapter of Berserk, which Miura had drafted in manuscript form, was finished by his assistants at Studio Gaga and published on September 10th of 2021 as the final issue with Miura as the credited author. At the time, all involved were very much still considering whether or how to move forward without him. In June of 2022, Hakusensha announced that the series would resume, and that Mori Koji, Miura's childhood friend, lifelong friend, would take over as the main author, working with the crew at Studio Gaga to continue writing the manga. Mori was the only person in whom Miura had confided his long-term plans for Berserk. Apparently, while writing the Eclipse chapters, which are the climax of the Golden Age arc, Miura had drafted the overall story of Berserk through to the end he wanted to do, and he had shared those ideas with Mori. Mori said that in the many years since, the story had progressed exactly as we discussed at the time, with almost no changes. And he promised to, quote, only write the episodes that Miura talked to me about. I will not flesh it out. I will not write episodes that I don't remember clearly. I will only write the lines and stories that Miura described to me. So since that time, 16 more chapters have been published since that announcement, with the most recent as of this recording coming in February 2025. If you're looking at like the volumes, the tankobon, the first 41 volumes comprise everything through chapter 364. The final one Miura is credited on. And then starting with volume 42 is the posthumous run, where it basically says, created by, original concept Miura Kentaro. I think it credits Mori as like the advisor to the series, basically something like that. It's not exactly written by, and then it's basically Studio Gaga credited with the art and creation. So a unique situation, obviously a tragic situation. I have not, gotten to those later chapters. From what I've heard, I think everyone is pretty much on the same page, which is that nobody expects them to be exactly what Miura would have done. But it's tremendously moving that all these people who were marked by him have continued trying to carry the series on. I don't think anyone looks at it as a cheap cash grab. It feels like a labor of love from people who wanted to honor, someone who was a friend, who was a mentor, who was a coworker. And I do think it's cool that that effort is going into it.
Yeah, and I have not read, I haven't even actually read like what the last few Miura chapters were, because I reached the point where this is like very, very broad spoilers for Berserk, but part of the main kind of impetus of the series from Guts' perspective is he wants to do two things. One, he wants to murder the shit out of Griffith, obviously. He's very angry about what Griffith has done, but also he's trying to heal Casca. And they reach the point where Casca gets healed. And I got to that point and I because I had been following it like sporadically for a while after I'd finished reading it, and getting just like updated, fan translated chapters online and stuff like that. But it was a very, very hard series to follow in any way because the releases of chapters were so inconsistent at that point because of Miura's health issues. And so I got to that point where you get that sort of resolved, and Casca is healed. And then I would kind of like felt like I had my catharsis, or enough of the catharsis I needed, and was able to kind of walk away from the series. I'm very curious to see like what happens past this point, just because while that like huge objective that had been there since all the way through to like what we are talking about today is what sets up that arc with Casca. It was such a long running arc, and yet at the same time, it did not feel like Berserk was anywhere near close to wrapping up. There's so much shit going on. Like getting Guts from where he was at to the point of like properly confronting Griffith just felt like so far away still. I'm very curious like what that kind of overall outline is and where it would go and what the conclusion is. I'm curious if they will ever actually get to that point, just because I have no idea what the outline is that they're kind of following, but I just can't imagine that it is a quick run to the end of Berserk from where the last time I was reading it. So yeah, it's just, I just remember being so devastated when I learned that he had passed away, both because it's like, part of it is that kind of selfish, like I really just love this series so much. It feels awful to just like not have this masterpiece work of art get to finish, but also he just was someone so respected and beloved by everyone in that community, both by fans, but also like other creators in Japan. And it's that kind of thing where he passed away, you just saw that incredible outpouring from everybody around the entire world, right? It's like whether you're in Japan or America or Europe, wherever, you just saw how many people creatively and kind of personally he touched with Berserk in this work, because it is so powerful. And I think it is something that touches on such personal themes that really has moved people so much and changed some people's lives, and having them confront like really powerful elements of things. And yeah, it was just so tragic when he passed away. And I'm very curious to see what happens with the series and how long it goes and stuff like that.
Yeah, and that is a story that has yet to be written, obviously. Yeah. So we will leave the story of the manga there and go back in time to the story of the anime. So the 1997 Berserk anime was produced by the studio OLM. If you're wondering what OLM stands for, it is Oriental Light and Magic, which is a play on George Lucas's ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, but also racially problematic, and they don't call themselves that anymore. They call themselves OLM, and we just don't talk about what the O stood for, and we're fine. So OLM is best known today for a very, very, very different anime that began its broadcast the same year, Pokémon. And I think that is the funniest goddamn thing in the world, and we'll talk about that more later, because literally everybody involved in Berserk 97 is a Pokémon vet, and it's the most amazing thing in the world. But OLM is an interesting beast of a studio. It is divided into specific production lines that operate independently and are named after the producer in charge of the unit. OLM has 6 of these in operation today, but has had many others over the years. So Pokémon, for instance, was originally made by OLM Team Ota, named for co-founder Ota Shoji. They were in charge of the Pokémon anime through 2006. Berserk is a production of Team Iguchi, named for Iguchi Noriaki, the producer. Amusingly, Team Iguchi would take over the production of Pokémon from 2006 to 2009 before handing off to Team Kato in 2010, who ran the show until 2024. So yes, it is still accurate to say the same team that made Berserk made Pokémon, specifically Pokémon Diamond and Pearl. Team Iguchi was disbanded after their work on Pokémon ended. So, they made it through Berserk, but they couldn't make it through Pokémon.
Nobody will ever make it through Pokemon.
That is a good
Pokemon,
point.
We will all be fucking dead and buried, and Pokemon will still be going.
But it's not even, the weirdness doesn't even stop there, Sean. Berserk was the second anime by Team Iguchi. They made their debut in 1995 with the comedy series Mojack, based on the manga by Fujiko F. Fujiko, the authors of Doraemon. Berserk premiered 6 months after Mojack finished its 74-episode run, and their next project after Berserk was Comic Party, an anime based on the dating sim game by Leaf. This just keeps getting weirder and weirder, the point being that Berserk is this towering, dark anime masterpiece that comes from a group of artists who basically never worked on anything remotely like it before or after, and I think that is fucking amazing.
Yes, that is very, very funny that they're all on like comedy series and dating like romance shows. And then it's like, and then here's your like medieval dark fantasy with like, sex and people getting their fucking heads cut off and shit, and, ends with some of the most like brutal, violent imagery you've seen in a show like this. And then and now let's do the dating sim show.
Because, Sean, usually this is the kind of recipe for a studio that messed up the show, right? Like that was given to the wrong group, not because they're not talented, but just because it takes a different set of muscles to do Berserk than it does to do Pokemon, obviously. But there were some talented people on this show who could do both. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Berserk 97 primarily adapts the Golden Age arc of the manga, which takes up volumes 4 through 13, but it is a bit more complicated than that. As someone who's fascinated by the process of cinematic and televisual adaptation, I truly think this is like one of the most interesting works of adaptation I've ever seen. So I want to break that down later once we get into talking about the show in the second half of today's episode. So we'll put a pin in that for now and come back to talking about how they adapted this show, because it's fascinating. But Berserk aired as a late-night anime on Wednesday mornings from 1:45 to 2:15 a.m. on Nippon TV. It began on October 8th, 1997, my 5th birthday, and ran through April 1st, 1998, which I guess means the finale of Berserk was an April Fool's joke, which would be good news for Guts and Casca, but man, dark joke.
It's an April Fool's joke for the audience. It's like fucking, because I obviously I know I knew the whole story, but I literally finished watching the show last night, so I did not know exactly like where does the show end. And it's it's I feel like this, while it does have the post-credit scene, I do feel like Berserk the anime should be spoken of in the same terms as Sopranos, with just a like fuck you endings. Like Jesus Christ.
Yes, it is.
Yes,
absolutely that kind of ending. Remember that late-night anime is still a pretty new phenomenon at this point, having really solidified around Neon Genesis Evangelion in 1995. So this show is able to go pretty far. Like, it's violent, it's sexual. It cannot go as far as probably an adaptation today could go, so there are certain things they cut that I think is understandable for 1997, even on late-night TV. But just, this is almost a 30-year-old show now, so things have changed. I could not personally find any good data on the series' success at the time. It had VHS volumes in the late 90s, then a DVD series release in the early 2000s. But for whatever the reason, Berserk 97 did not receive any kind of follow-up, and Berserk did not have another anime project until the 2010s. There were 2 video games that are sort of corollary to this. In 1999, there's a Dreamcast game that we got in the US as Sword of the Berserk, Guts' Rage. In Japan, it was called Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc, Chapter of the Flowers of Oblivion. It's a hack and slash game set much deeper into the manga between volumes 22 and 23. The voice cast of the anime returned for that game, as did the composer, Hirasawa Susumu, and that again came out in English even though the manga had not been localized yet and the show wouldn't come out in English until the early 2000s, and they were years and years away from getting to the Millennium Falcon arc, so kind of a Dragon Ball GT final bout situation there. That game did get a sequel, Japan only this time in 2004 for the PS2, Berserk Millennium Falcon arc chapter of the Holy Demon War. Again, the cast of the 97 show was there with Hirasawa doing the music. And in the early 2010s, well, for a while that was it for Berserk adaptations. Yeah. Then in the early 2010s, there was a project announced called the Berserk Sagas Project, and it was an intention to adapt the entire manga arc by arc. It began with a film trilogy of the Golden Age arc again, produced by Studio 4C, released in 2012 and 2013. For this version, the cast was completely redone, so all new voice actors in Japanese, and that's the cast that has mostly stayed in place through subsequent works. This trilogy has mixed reception among the fan base, not necessarily a lot of outright hate, but not a lot of intense love either. Mostly a lot of confusion about why you jump right back in with the exact same arc that had already been done kind of perfectly. There are some things that trilogy is able to do that the original show was not, including the very end of the arc. But there's also a lot it's not able to do because it's 3 movies, all less than 2 hours, and so it has to cut a lot and really get down to the bones of it. I've looked at clips of this. I was scrubbing through the movies last night. I'll be honest, I don't really like the animation style and the use of CG, and I don't, other than Griffith, who is an interesting piece of casting, I don't really think the Japanese voice actors are right. It doesn't seem like my cup of tea. One day, maybe when I have more distance from the 97 anime, I'll give it a watch. But it's an interesting thing that did not move forward. That was the end of the Berserk Sagas project, because that film trilogy, I guess, just didn't quite make enough to keep going.
I just remember it being very weird. And I always was confused by it for a long time, because for a very long time, I assumed that those movies were like a re-edit of the old TV show, because it just seemed very, as someone who'd read the manga but had not seen any of the anime stuff, because obviously this is a thing that happened. I mean, fucking Zeta Gundam did it. You could have done it for a 1997 anime and just say, hey, let's do a compilation movie and put all this stuff together. And put some new stuff in there and things like that. And it was only until much, much later that I realized, oh, those are 2 totally distinctly separate adaptations. Like, why do Berserk things only ever kind of go for this one arc that also is like the least, well, it's like, obviously it's incredible. It's also like the least representative part of the broader storyline. Like, it's so divergent from what the rest of the series is. I just have always found it fascinating that we have 2 kind of big adaptations that got stuck there and then never went into the, what in my head is the actual storyline of Berserk, which is Guts in the modern day with his band of buddies going around killing the fuck out of demons. It's very strange that you would have just gone for the Golden Age arc again when you made these movies.
Well, Sean, I've got great news for you. Someone did finally do it. Monkey's Paw Curls. So, again, Berserk Sagas project by Studio 4C does not go forward. Instead, in 2016, a new Berserk TV anime begins. It starts midway through the Conviction arc, does not do Lost Children, which is one of the most beloved parts of the manga, and it is animated in the world's absolute worst 3D CGI, awkwardly cel-shaded to try to look like the manga, but it doesn't. It was animated by a studio called Gemba, who you have not heard of because this is their only series they ever did. It did get a second season in 2017 that adapted the first half or so of the Millennium Falcon arc. It never returned. We shall speak no more of it. It is hideous. It is horrifying. I haven't watched it, and I'm not going to watch it. It looks scary to me.
For the record, I tried to get you to put this on our Grand Tour,
no,
and you wouldn't fucking have it. I'm like, damn it.
So Sean,
I wanted to get back at you for Dragon Ball GT, and you just wouldn't let me.
Well, I mean, you would have been torturing yourself too. My biggest thing with that was I didn't think, and I was correct, that I would have time to read the manga up to where that anime goes, and I was not going to allow my first experience of those stories to be the 2016 anime. That would be cruel to the memory of Miura-san. So I think I made the right call there.
Yes. Needless to say, I have not ever had the stomach to watch these. It's why I wanted to put it on the podcast. This is the only way I'd ever be able to ever see this. And I have like a sick curiosity about it, but nowhere near enough to actually watch it beyond the clips that everybody shares online about how awful it looked. Because, I mean, full 3D CG anime have come a long way since 2016. But even in 2016, that thing was aberrant amongst its peers. It's
the same time as Land of the Lustrous, and
yes.
they look like they are from different centuries. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So no good there. There was a new Berserk video game in 2016. It's a Berserk Musou game. In the US, we got it as Berserk and the Band of the Hawk, which is on PS4 and Steam. It used the new voice cast. Then the most recent thing is that in 2022, there was a new TV edit of the Studio 4C Golden Age film trilogy called Berserk, the Golden Age Arc Memorial Edition, that comprised 13 episodes. It retouched a bunch of the animation. It added several scenes that were completely inexplicably left out of the movies, including the Campfire of Dreams scene, which might be the most pivotal thematic scene of the Golden Age arc. Not in the original version of those movies, just to tell you what a kind of mess those were. But for now, the original Berserk anime from 97 remains by far the most widely beloved and respected adaptation of Miura's work. Miura's sudden passing in 2021, combined with the new Blu-ray restoration that started going outside Japan around the world in the 2020s, that made the series available in English-speaking countries again, I think has definitely led to a resurgence of interest in this show over the last few years, which is why we came to it and are now talking all about it.
Yeah. And while it's very frustrating that you have this like incredibly seminal manga that just does not have a more comprehensive kind of adaptation, it makes sense to me that Berserk doesn't, just because I think this is a hell of a thing to try to adapt, like both in terms of just like the scope and size of the series, but also what it is, like how adult the content is and how much kind of care that needs in adaptation, the art style, which is so intense. Like, I very much understand the instinct for wanting to use 3D CGI to adapt this, just in the sense of like the workload and trying to figure out how do you do the character designs in 2D. Like, it's a very difficult series, I think, to adapt, which is what makes this show so impressive. That even if it is not a comprehensive adaptation, it is a complete feeling one of the arc it chooses to adapt, and it's so successful at that adaptation. But it does not surprise me that kind of nobody else managed to really crack how to get that to work. Especially when, like, if you think that it's hard to do the Berserk art stuff in the Golden Age arc, just imagine all the fucking demon shit you have to do, because it gets way more complicated past that. So yeah, it's very frustrating that we don't have more really good Berserk anime. But I definitely am not confused by why we don't have more good Berserk anime.
I'm not confused either. I do think someone will take another crack at it one day. It is a popular enough series. The comparison that has made me think it is possible, and I know this is a very different show, but the existence of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which is based on a similarly ungodly, much longer manga than Berserk, that also had several false starts in adaptation that was long thought to be unadaptable, and that studio has figured out a way to make it work. Now, JoJo's has a one-up in that it is more friendly for more age groups, and its arc division allows you to kind of do discrete anime, but you could still do, I think someone will figure it out one day. I think part of the problem also, though, is that, Berserk is still an ongoing thing in the manga. How do you kind of tie it all together? I think we'll see someone take another crack at the apple, but it'll be a while.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is just a thing that people are going to keep like breaking their boats against the shores of Berserk and trying to figure out how to land on that thing. Maybe somebody will figure it out in the future, but we'll see.
Well, let's talk about the people who figured it out in 1997, Sean.
Yes.
Here is the crew of the 97 Berserk anime, starting with our series director, is Takahashi Naohito. This was Takahashi's first TV series as an overall director. Most of his credits up to this point were as an animation director or character designer on various series, including a bunch of episodes of Maison Ikkoku, continuing our Takahashi Rumiko theme of this season, and prompting us to do an actual Takahashi Rumiko season in the future. He has
we have to, because everybody
Yes.
started on a Takahashi Rumiko show. That's just like the thing we have learned on our grand tour, is a grand tour of anime, and also just like the black hole in the center of the galaxy we're touring through is just Takahashi Rumiko. Like, that's what it is.
Yes. So he had directed a few TV episodes and OVAs, but again, Berserk was his first full series. And he has been with OLM exclusively ever since. He jumped over to OLM Team Wasaki and directed totally nonstop for several years. The 1999 Leaf visual novel adaptation To Heart, then Steel Angel Kurumi and its sequel series and OVAs, then the show Figure 17, then he came back to Team Iguchi where he directed the comedy Croquette, which ran for 104 episodes. So he, from the start of Berserk, was directing regularly, like basically a TV show on the air every week from 97 through about 2006, when he also went to Team Iwasa for a 39-episode Agatha Christie show about Poirot and Miss Marple. And so, yeah, he then, after all of that, took a few years off directing, focused mainly on storyboarding and animation directing, including storyboarding the 2006 Animal Crossing film that OLM Team Kame made. And then he did return to directing in 2011 for 3 successive Dan Ball Senki anime, localized in English as Little Battler's Experience, from 2011 to 2013 for Team Inoue, and he has since stepped back from directing to mainly do storyboarding and key animation, including on several of the Pokemon films. But it makes sense to me that the person who did this anime has a very strong, like, animation direction, character design experience, because that's one of the strengths of this show. And yeah, just a fascinating career. You have a really weird credit on this show that I've never seen anywhere else. It's Series Concept Advisor, written out in katakana. So it is an English title, and it is given to Imagawa Yasuhiro. Again, a credit I've never seen before. It's actually given in the closing credits, not the opening, which is interesting. Very unusual for a credit that appears in every single episode. There is no series composition credit on Berserk, so it's possible this was similar to that role. It's possible he's like a secondary director. I don't know, and it is unclear, but Imagawa is someone we've actually talked before about on this show because he was the director of Mobile Fighter G Gundam, the very first alternate universe Gundam show, and before that he was a longtime Sunrise veteran who storyboarded and directed on a ton of Tomino shows. We're definitely going to be talking about him on the Tomino season of this show because he worked on Zeta Gundam and Combat Metal Mecha Zabungle and Aura Battler Dunbine and Heavy Metal L Game, and he also directed the very celebrated Giant Robo OVA series in the 90s. So a very big talent. Unclear what his exact role on Berserk was, but talented person.
I think it's very clear what he did. He advised on the concept of the series, and that's it.
Series Concept Advisor. We should do Berserk. That's, yeah.
It's a great concept. We should do a series of it.
So in terms of writing, again, there is no series composition credit. It has 5 writers who swap between the various episodes. And those 5 writers are almost all very heavy hitters who have done prolific work as head writers in the years since. Starting with Tomioka Atsuhiro, who writes episodes 1, 6, 11, and 16. Incredibly prolific anime writer who started filling series composer credits on dozens of shows after he finished work on Berserk, including the aforementioned Croquette, Samurai 7, Trinity Blood, Inazuma 11, the Captain Tsubasa remake, the Digimon Adventure remake, and on Pokemon from Diamond and Pearl through Black and White to X and Y, an extremely long run as the series composer on that show. He's written 65 episodes of One Piece. He did the screenplay for the very good One Piece Stampede movie, and he has a whopping 252 episodes of Pokemon under his belt, which is amazing.
God, like you could just show episodes of his Pokemon for years and years.
Yes.
It's like fucking crazy.
And that's not, and again, that's ones that he personally wrote or has a writing credit on. And I want to stress that with these Pokemon credits, because everyone I'm about to name has these are conservative estimates because Pokemon is divided in all credits databases into like 20 different shows, and I counted them all up as best I could, but it's very possible I missed some. So this is a minimum of 252 episodes of Pokemon.
God.
Then we've got Itakura Makoto, who wrote episodes 3, 8, 13, 18, and 22. Not a ton of other anime writing credits I could find. He's the only person of these 5 who is not a major anime writer, but he is one of the credited writers on Yakuza 2, the original game. So that's cool. Yeah. Then we've got Fujita Shinzo, who wrote episodes 5, 10, 15, 20, 21, and the finale 25. They wrote 4 Lupin III specials in the 90s, including 2 that we covered in our Lupin season, Tokyo Crisis and Island of Assassins. They co-wrote The Pursuit of Harimau's Treasure with the next writer, Yonemura. and hundreds of episodic writing credits, including 140 episodes of Pokémon and 36 episodes of One Piece, and is now the series composer on a bunch of the Duel Masters shows, as well as several of the Shin Megami Tensei anime adaptations. Then we have Yonemura Shoji, who wrote episodes 4, 9, 14, 19, and 23. One of their first credits was co-writing the 1995 Lupin III special Pursuit of Harimao's Treasure, which was the last Lupin special directed by Dezaki Osamu. Several big series composer credits, but he is undeniably best known now as the series composer on One Piece since episode 783, the beginning of Whole Cake Island, and still fills that role to this day. So they are the lead writer on anime's, the current creative renaissance of One Piece too, because this has been such an amazing period for One Piece. And he also, if you're wondering, did this guy write for Pokemon? Yes, he wrote for Pokemon. He's written 154 episodes of Pokemon. Come on.
God.
Finally, we have Ohashi Yukiyoshi, who wrote episodes 2, 7, 12, 17, and 24. They've written 159 episodes of Pokemon. They are the series composer on Yu Yu Hakusho and Hikaru no Go, wrote 25 episodes of Fist of the North Star and 6 of Fist of the North Star 2, which is a cool Berserk connection. And all of this got me thinking, how many combined episodes of Pokemon have the writers of Berserk written? And here's a stat that you should totally break out at parties because it is amazing. 4 of the 5 writers of Berserk, Tomioka, Fujita, Yonemura, and Ohashi, have written a combined 705 episodes of Pokemon. Just an amazing fact that the writers of the dark fantasy epic, the Sword-Wind Romance Berserk, have written over 700 episodes of Pokemon.
That's fucking wild. I do also say, though, Jonathan, there's a part of my brain that just is very bugged by the fact that it's a 25-episode show. We've got 5 writers on it, and almost everybody does exactly 5 episodes in intervals of 5, except for fucking Tomioka Atsuhiro only did 4, so Fujita Shinzo had to fucking pick up that slack, did 20 and 21, they had to do 6 episodes. If they had, it's almost like the mathematically perfect number, and it really bugs me that everything's in intervals of 5 except for those 2. Come on, Tomioka, pick it up, man. What are you doing?
To be clear, we do not know what happened, but, you know.
Yes.
All right, in terms of episode directors, there's a bunch here. Most of them are all career episode directors, storyboard artists, animation directors, not people who typically run shows themselves, but they have very long lists of credits, clearly incredibly accomplished. We don't have time to get into everything all of them have done. I will name them in just a moment. But there are 3 directors on the show who are a little more notable to the series. Takahashi Naohito, the series director, also personally directed the finale, episode 25. So blame him for your pain and suffering watching that episode. Because it's great, not because it drops the ball at the last minute. Fukazawa Koji, who is the show's property design credit, we'll talk about them in a second, directed episode 23. And then the premiere of the show was directed by one Tsurumaki Kazuya, the acclaimed director of Mobile Suit Gundam G-Quacks, among many, many other things. Tsurumaki, we've already talked about this season several times. This is, I believe, the first episode of TV Tsurumaki is ever credited with directing. He had directed things like the Gunbuster Science Lesson shorts, some of the extra shorts for Nadia, Secret of Blue Water. He is one of the original Studio Gainax guys, just to refresh your memory. He is the director of the amazing anime opening of Evangelion, and then he co-directed End of Eva the same year as Berserk. But this is the beginning of his career directing TV, and his first major step away from Gainax, and hit it out of the park. It's a good episode of TV.
Oh, yeah. It's very good. It makes sense that you'd also have someone who's feels like a real outside person to do that one, just because it is such a different episode than anything else in the series, because that's obviously your Black Swordsman episode, that's sort of broadly adapting kind of the first chapter. And yeah, it's very good, and it makes a lot of sense you get someone like him to do that.
Also someone who is a veteran of, at this point, the most famous late-night anime. In Evangelion. Yes. I think that is also a connection that was probably conscious. Our other directors are Amiya Masakazu, who did 2, 7, 12, 18, and 24, the most of anyone. Ono Kazuhisa did episode 3. Geshi Yasuhiro did 4. Yamaguchi Mihiro did 5, 13, and 19. Matsumura Yasuhiro did 6, 11, and 17. Yoshikawa Koji did 8, 14, and 20. Hiro Yukina did 9, 16, and 22. And Okazaki Yukino did 10, 15, and 21. So those are our directors on the show. And I didn't list out all the individual storyboard artists. There's a shit ton on this show. They're all very talented. The storyboarding on this show is great, although it does very carefully follow Miura's art. I noticed watching it because I read the manga alongside the show this time, and it was interesting to see. It's a really cool how they translate the manga into storyboards, into episodes. Really well done. Then in terms of other credits, there's some really interesting ones here. The character design credit is split in two. There's a main character design credit and then a character design credit. And with the character design, it's literally written as main in katakana character design. And that is Umakoshi Yoshihiko. Umakoshi is a very prolific character designer who first came to prominence on Marmalade Boy in 1994, and they are best known today as the main character designer on all things My Hero Academia. They don't have a lot of time for other stuff. That's a big project. But for the main characters, I think Berserk does such a tremendous job translating Miura's art of his characters in a way that is still doable in animation. And so huge credit to Umakoshi. Look at things like how they capture Guts' hair and the way Miura, the very distinctive way he does the shading in the hair, or like the many very ambiguous facial expressions Griffith has. It makes sense to me actually why this show has two character designers for two groupings, because there's all the side characters, and then to have someone in charge of, I assume, like the main, 3, 4, 5 characters, boy, they do a great job.
Yeah, and it makes sense also just because, like we were saying with the manga, a big feature of Miura's art is that there's such a variety of character designs where you don't have that sensation of like, here's a couple of templates of characters with specific pieces swapped out, which is, again, a totally normal thing to do in a series. But like the variety of like shapes and sizes of people is so extreme in Berserk that I just feel like, and there's such a large number of characters of like, because it's just like all the random people in the court or the generals on the other side and stuff like that. There's so many people that it makes a lot of sense that you'd have to divide that responsibility up between two different character designers.
And the other person just credited with character design is Matsubara Norihiro. Matsubara also serves as chief animation director. We'll talk about that in a second. Matsubara did in-betweens and key animation on many notable shows in the 80s, including Takahata Isau's Chie the Brat and Miyazaki Hayau's Sherlock Hound, before landing at OLM in the 90s, where they have worked on at least 47 distinct Pokémon productions. Movies, TV shows, spin-offs, OVAs, what have you, usually as the character designer, often also as the animation director. If you have ever watched anything Pokemon, Matsubara touched it, and they also touched Berserk, and that's awesome.
Yeah, so they're just, it's so similar. I'm sure just like needed the exact same approach in terms of the character designs. That's always what I felt when I look at characters from Pokemon. Just like, God, they just look so like real. They're so like, just the proportions, all of it is so realistic. It's just like Berserk.
Misty is really the Casca of Pokemon.
Let's not think about that comparison too much. Let's not go too far down that road is all I'm going to say.
Is Brock Griffith or is Ash Griffith? Which one?
I will say that like this entire time, whenever you bring up Pokemon, I am just thinking about the most horrific fucking, it's the Eclipse, but Brock is Griffith. And it's just like, it's not a path your brain wants to go down, but unfortunately my brain has been there for like 15 minutes.
Instead of being on the big eldritch hand, he's on an onyx at the top. Yeah, and Ash has to climb the onyx. Oh, it'd be great. Anyway.
Yeah, it's like Femto, but instead of like the hawk thing, it's like a big Pokeball around his head. It's just, yeah.
All right. Our chief animation director is Matsubara Norihiro, along with Chiba Yuriko. Chiba has some really awesome credits on her resume. One of her earliest is the character designer and animation director for the music video to White Reflection, the theme song for Gundam Wing Endless Waltz, which is something cool you should check out. And they stayed with director Takahashi on his next few shows at OLM in a similar capacity before going off in 2006 to do Code Geass. Is that how you say that? Geass? Code
Geass.
Code Geass. I don't have the katakana in front of me, as the chief animation director. So that is where Chiba went after that. And Chiba was also the animation director on the first Unicorn Gundam OVA. So lots of good mecha crossovers here too. Then there is a credit that I've never seen before called Property Design, again written in katakana, and this is Fukazawa Koji. Fairly non-standard credit, but I'm assuming it refers to the design of swords, armor, castles, all of that stuff, which makes total sense for this show. Put someone in charge of that, because boy, there's a lot of it. Fukazawa is also an OLM vet who mainly does key animation and animation direction, and then did direct one episode of the series as well, episode 23, which looks amazing. That's where the eclipse starts, so yeah.
Yeah, and this show has so much going on in terms of, because again, this is just all stuff that you're pulling from the manga, but like the very elaborate use of armor, you know, like the armor is not just sort of like generic plate armor. Like there's a lot of like really good specific detail pulled from historical plate armor. Like it's not, you know, and I'm obviously not an expert on that stuff, but from what I do understand, it does not appear like truly authentic to me, but it's like reaching for a greater degree of authenticity for like depicting historical armor than you get in a normal kind of series like this. But it's just so detailed, and you just have so many extra little pieces that most series would just not bother to depict. And if you're bringing that over from the manga's art style, you need to have people who are in charge of making sure that all of that stuff looks correct, because that's not easy to do. Like that's not easy to animate. This is like, that's one of the reasons why you can see the instinct of wanting to make something like Berserk a 3D CG series, is there's just so many complex structures and so much rigid armor and clothing on characters that it's so like geometrically intricate that it's very understanding why you would want to start using CG stuff, whether you're talking about the Golden Age arc movies or the full CG series. If only, you know, that... and I think you could do it, you just have to be a lot more successful at how you implement it than I think those were, based on what I saw.
But, you know, one of the big things that Berserk 97 decides to do is to go for a more Dezaki Osamu style limited animation style in order to capture the sort of power of the single image of Miura's art rather than sort of that art in full motion. And for that, we do have to highlight the art director of this show. And that is Kobayashi Shichiro, one of the most significant creative forces on this show, because given what I just said, the background art and some of those Dezaki-style postcard moments are absolutely crucial, and that's what the art director is in charge of. And so, in many ways, you could call Kobayashi and his team the aesthetic heart of this version of Berserk. And when it comes to background art, Kobayashi is a legend among legends. He started his career at the very beginning of anime at Toei Doga in 1964, but quickly founded his own studio, Kobayashi Productions, in 1968 to specialize in background art. So, if you've ever watched anime, you've seen his work or seen work by someone who worked for him or who was influenced by him, because Kobayashi Productions has been a partner on hundreds and hundreds of anime over the years. Just some things you might know him from where he was the art director. And again, Kobayashi Pro has worked on plenty of things where he wasn't literally the art director. Kyojin no Hoshi from 1968, the movie version of Aim for the Ace, and then the sequel TV series Shin Aim for the Ace, the 1978 Dezaki Treasure Island, Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro, Miyazaki's debut feature, Tomorrow's Joe 2 in 1981, the second and third Urusei Yatsura movies from 84 and 85, Lupin III, The Fuma Conspiracy, 87, which we talked about, one of the most brilliantly animated things we've ever watched. And in the same year as Berserk, he also did Revolutionary Girl Utena. So Kobayashi, absolute legend. As was standard on shows Kobayashi worked on, all the background art was handled in-house by Kobayashi's staff at Kobayashi Productions. And those background animators are Shimada Akio, Nakamura Hideki, Takahashi Kazuhiko, Akiyama Kentaro, Oda Rie, Kurahashi Takashi, Makino Tokiko, Kakimoto Yaoki. We don't usually name all the background artists, but I wanted to at least give them a brief shout out because the background art in Berserk is out of this world, particularly as once it gets going, some of the stuff in the later half of the show. And many of those people I just named are people whose work you've also probably seen in plenty of other places. Just related to things on this season, Kentaro and Akio both worked on multiple episodes of Dororo 2019, and Kurahashi did background art for 10 of the 20 episodes of Dragon Ball Daima, which we're talking about next week. And Nakamura Hideki has become particularly notable. He's the art director on multiple Gundam projects, including Thunderbolt and the Hathaway's Flash movie. and on the Yuasa Masaki movie Inuo, which is one of the great movies of the 2020s so far. And then he also did carry over to be the art director on Berserk, the Golden Age trilogy of movies. So someone from Kobayashi's team did go over to work on those films. And from what I've seen of those films, I do think the backgrounds are the best part of them. They're really lovely. That trilogy is done in widescreen, so there's these big widescreen panoramas. This team, best in the business, and you can very much see that at work in this show.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is, as you said, like, we don't normally go into this level of detail on the art directors and the background art, but in this instance, it is absolutely essential because it is the defining aesthetic touch. Because I do think, like, watching the show, the main idea of the show from an aesthetic point of view is very much like, we can't or couldn't get Dezaki Osamu to direct this, but we really want the Dezaki Osamu version of Berserk, and so they have kind of done everything they can to bring it into that style, whether you're talking about the way that the characters move and animate, whether you're talking about the sound mix and the way that music is used and the sound effects, the way that the actors are directed, and then especially that background art, and then the use of the postcard memories technique, where you have those kind of like freeze frames that are these like incredibly gorgeous kind of painterly style moments with a moving camera. Like, there's just so many hallmarks of Dezaki Osamu's style that they're bringing into this production. And, you know, considering the fact that Kobayashi Shichiro has worked on a huge number of Dezaki Osamu's most famous things he did, it just feels like that aesthetic tradition is so overwhelmingly powerful in Berserk, that it, you know, this Kobayashi Shichiro is absolutely one of the most important people in that production. And you can tell just by watching the series, like, it is an essential part of what makes it what it is.
Absolutely. And we'll talk more about that as we get into it. Final credit for this show that we'll talk about is the music, which might be the best thing about the show, and that is by Hirasawa Susumu, an artist best known in the world of anime for his work with Kon Satoshi on the film Millennium Actress and Paprika, and the anime series Paranoia Agent, and then also obviously very well known for his work on Berserk because he has been associated with the soundtrack for every single incarnation of the show, the only creative figure who did that. But Hirasawa is also an incredibly prolific musician and artist outside of soundtracks, mainly in electronic music. His solo career began with the album Water in Time and Space in 1989, the same year Berserk began its serialization, and Miura was actually an enthusiastic fan of Hirasawa's music and liked to listen to it while writing and drawing. And this directly led to Hirasawa's hiring for the show, and the two developed a close friendship that lasted the rest of Miura's life. So there's a very personal connection there, and I wish I was more of a musicologist to break this down. Frankly, the Hirasawa soundtrack for Berserk deserves its own fucking podcast. It's one of the greatest soundtracks for anything I have ever heard. The show doesn't actually use a ton of music. They are very careful in the moments they deploy it. And when they deploy it, it will fucking wreck you, because Hirasawa did not write the soundtrack anybody else would even begin to think of for Berserk, for anything medieval, and yet, like, I usually, when I'm reading Berserk the manga, I will sometimes just turn on the Hirasawa soundtrack to listen to while I'm reading it, because it just, there's something about it that expresses the soul of this world in a way that few other soundtracks are capable of doing. I think it's an unbelievable accomplishment.
Yeah, it's an amazing soundtrack that's also used so effectively by the show, which I think is really key. And this is one of those Dezaki Osamu influences, I think, is the very limited soundscape for so much of it, that it's like trying to use all of those individual pieces, the actors, the sound effects, and the music to their utmost, and not trying to clutter the sound space too much, which is what you need for Berserk, because Berserk is a very raw series. Like, the subject matter and what it's discussing is very intense and very personal. And so you need to have this very open audio space for the characters to exist in, and a slightly more almost kind of theatrical energy to the way that is presented. And that means I don't think you want to score this too excessively. And so, yeah, the way the music is used is so effective. And there is that one track in particular that plays at kind of like the most critical moments, that has that big sweeping kind of choral, not sweeping is the wrong word, like this very intimate choral section that I think for me most distinctively plays on like the Bonfire of Dreams moment, but it plays throughout like key sections of the whole show. That is such a powerful moment of emotional punctuation that the show uses with such economy and grace. Like it's just really phenomenal. And so it is the combination of having such an exceptional soundtrack that is so in tuned with that very raw personal energy that Berserk carries, but also knowing the exact moments in which to deploy that music for it to be as effective as possible. And it's the combination of those two things that I think make it so good, because it is absolutely this and that the art direction are to me like the two most critical pieces of the overall aesthetic presentation of the series that makes it click and makes it work. And you need that for Berserk to work in animation. Like, I think those two things are the most essential, and it's the thing the show nails more than anything else.
Absolutely. And again, I just love anytime you hear a soundtrack and you go, whoa, that's not the soundtrack I was expecting for this thing. Because like medieval works, like Berserk, has a very kind of, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings aesthetic, at least to start in the Golden Age. Obviously, it goes off in different directions. And, you kind of know what to expect from that. And it's so cool to hear Hirasawa come in and say, we're not doing that at all. And yet, when you hear it, it sounds perfect. It's what you didn't think you needed, but you did. And I always love when a soundtrack can pull that off. The later Berserk stuff, while Hirasawa contributed basically theme songs and stuff, the Golden Age arc trilogy and then the 2016 anime are done by Shiro Sagisu, who is the composer for Evangelion, and all of the other Anno Hideaki stuff in the modern era. Obviously a hugely talented musician. What I've heard of those soundtracks and like seeing clips, it is much closer to like the big, like epic kind of more Western style score you would maybe expect looking at the imagery of Berserk. And to me, it's very hard for me to think of this show without this soundtrack, because it's also one of those things that I can imagine if there had been a season 2 of the 97 anime and they had gotten into like Conviction Arc and all of that stuff, you could have kept using this music. You could have used this style of music. Like it would have connected the world of Berserk in such an amazing way. And that's one of the things that's so special about it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And the choice not to just go for the kind of generically cinematic orchestral score, which I think is kind of what you expect with your kind of medieval fantasy and your kind of, this sort of very, it's like, obviously the setting is sort of historically this alt history-ish kind of 100 Years War sort of period. And that's kind of what you're expecting, is that big symphonic orchestra. And instead it's so personal. It's so intimate. It feels like it is just like the music you're hearing to get access to Guts' interiority, and that's it. It's not about setting the scene or whatever. It's not the music for the place. It's the music for him as a character, and that's just the perfect choice, and the choice you need to make for Berserk.
Speaking of perfect choices made for Berserk, let's talk about the theme song and ending song to Berserk, because this is one of the most weird and, I gotta say, fucking delightful parts of this show. The opening is a song called Tell Me Why by Pen Pals. Pen Pals are a band formed in 1996. Their debut album, self-titled obviously, was released on VAP the same year as Berserk, 97. The names to their songs, they're basically like a Japanese punk band, but from the late 90s. Their song titles are amazing. It includes songs like Astro Motel, 70 Times, Horoscope, Apis, Prop Shot, Tonight, Fitness USA, American Man, Choking Hazard, I'm a Sneaker, Texas Hurricane, No, Punk You, and Jenny is Dead. The Pen Pals disbanded in 2005, did one revival concert in 2011, and then 3 of the members did form a new band in 2019 called AFOK that still performs some of the Pen Pals catalog. It's a weird song. The closing is Waiting So Long by the Silverfins. I could find no information about that band on the Japanese or English internet. Sean, what did you think about the opening and ending to Berserk 97?
Yeah.
I have thoughts, but I want to hear you as the newbie here. What did you make when you started hearing the completely out of tune guitar work of Tell Me Why at the beginning of every episode of this show?
I just started laughing immediately because it is not, as someone who had read the manga, it is not really what you expect coming in. Because yes, it is. It's got this like, it's not quite Green Day pop punk. But it's like it's somewhere halfway between like Green Day and a kind of light grunge band. Like it's 96, 97. That's kind of like the sonic space you're in. You're not quite at that Green Day-ish pop punk sound you get in like a lot of the early Naruto opening themes, but you're like getting close to there. It's just like, man, that is not what Berserk should sound like at all. But for me, it's the combination of the fucking song and then the opening animation, which I thought I put in the notes, some screenshots I took, because the opening animation in the second half, you just get this montage of shots that I can only describe as like a Guts photo shoot for a men's health magazine. Like, it's so ridiculous where he's posing and flexing and smiling at the camera. And I had to fucking take screenshots of all of those. I have them all in a folder now, and I put them into our notes document because they're just so fucking funny. And every time getting this kind of like punk-ish, grunge-ish song, and you get these images of Guts posing for a photo shoot is just the funniest fucking thing in the world. It's so out there for an opening for Berserk. Although there is, like, I do think one thing this show does with Guts, more so than I remember from this point in the manga, although maybe if I get back to it, I'll have a different perspective on it. But there's definitely a, like, hunkification of Guts. Like, he's a real beefcake in the show, and like he feels like sexualized by the show more than I remember Guts being at this point in the manga. Like, Guts becomes like sexualized in the manga to me more from what I remember later when he's like Daddy Guts. He has that kind of energy. But I don't remember that quite being where the series was at in the Golden Age. But you definitely have moments where Guts is like in the background of a shot, basically posing and flexing his muscles and being a total beefcake, and it like feels like he's intentionally sexualized, which I don't have a problem with. But that combined with this opening just cracks me up over and over again, because it's just like it feels like the show is very self-conscious of trying to make hunky Guts for you, and just get everyone up on Guts really hard, and it's such a funny combination of things in that opening. Oh man! Every time it started playing, I laughed, which is not I think the effect you want from the audience. But I can't say I don't like it. Like it would just be dishonest for me to say that I think it's bad or that I dislike it. Do I think it's appropriate for Berserk? No. Did I enjoy it? Honestly, yes.
That's where I'm at too. I've seen this show twice, so I've watched that opening like 50 times. Maybe it's Stockholm Syndrome. I love it. I think does it fit? No. Do I have a lot of weird affection for it? Yes. Here's the thing. This show also has an insert song called Berserk Forces by Hirasawa Susumu, the composer of the show. That song is played in a couple of the early episodes within the body of the episode, and then it is always used as the next episode preview music. I have no way to prove this. I have no evidence for this. But it is my overwhelming suspicion that Berserk Forces was written with the intention to be the opening theme, and that the choice to go with Tell Me Why and Waiting So Long, which are both by artists represented by the producer of the show, VAP, with Pen Pals having a big debut album at the same time, I'm thinking maybe that wasn't the choice of the show's creative team.
Yes, this is because these are very obviously not songs written for the show, which this is much more common back at this point. Nowadays, I feel like the anime song thing is big enough for a while that it's gotten very rare that you just kind of take a popular artist's like existing single or single that's about to debut and just slap it onto a show. But you definitely did it a lot more back in this time. And that's what this feels like. Because actually, Jonathan, we have talked about that before, because in Dirty Pair, this is the subsidiary of Nihon TV that handled the OVA releases of Dirty Pair after it was off the air. That then also was for all of the later, like the OVAs and the songs for all of those, was also the label part of VAP, the music producer part of it. It was all artists assigned to that. And so there's like a weird connection here, because the two main sponsors for Berserk you see at the beginning of the credits is Nihon TV and VAP, which are both part of the same larger company. So I think you're absolutely right. We have no direct like testimony to this fact, but it feels very blatantly apparent that at the very least it was not the team's choice to pick these songs. I don't think that would be true at all. And whether or not Berserk Forces was going to be the OP, or maybe they just sort of out of protest were like, we need to have our own song for the show, and they just like made that even if it was never going to be the OP, who knows? But Berserk Forces feels like it should be the opening theme. It is very notable to me that it plays during the next episode preview, which I don't think I've ever seen another show that has an insert song that consistently is used in that format, which feels like where you would put like the bridge section of your opening theme or something is what usually you would do, or a key part of the instrumental soundtrack. But using an insert song like that all the time is very unusual. It is very, very interesting. I will say there is, if you have the Discotheque release on disc 2, one of the bonus features is an AMV directed by Kon Satoshi to Berserk Forces. And someone at some point, it's the full version of the song, so it's not edited to be an anime opening. But somebody should just take the first 90 seconds of that and just make a torrent online of Berserk with that replacing the opening theme, just to see what that's like.
Yes.
Just take 90 seconds of the Kon Satoshi AMV using Berserk Forces, just make that the opening. It uses lots of footage from the existing opening, just intercut with footage from the show. It's very well edited, as I think you would suspect that Kon Satoshi directed it. But it's a very strange situation, the way the music works out here.
But Sean, I'm not letting us move on from this without reciting the lyrics to tell me why, at least. Hopefully waiting so long, too. But this is a thing we love to do on this show. So Sean, please take it away. Please read us again, these are the actual things they sing in broken English in the opening to Berserk in every episode. Take it away.
All right, and I have to just note for the audience that I will be reading this while also staring at my collage of Guts photos I put into our notes of him posing. So I feel like I'm in the right emotional space for this. So this is Tell Me Why. Feel no shame about shape. Weather changes their phrase. Even mother will show you another way. So put your glasses on. Nothing will be wrong. There's no blame. There's no fame. It's up to you. The first words should be finded. Whatever holds you back, I can get it off. Tell me what you want. I don't know why you're afraid. Tell me what you say. I don't know why. Too late. It's too late.
That made my day. That was great.
All right, do you want me to do Waiting So Long?
We gotta do Waiting So Long. Come on, it's even weirder.
Yes, all right. This is Waiting So Long. Looking back, the morning comes. Don't find your face in your glass. Take the moonlight by the tail. It's a rainy sight you're shading. What is that? It's just the same. What is trying your crown? I'm spinning my glass, walking back. So wear my glass. You are fading. I'm waiting so long. I'm waiting so long. I'm waiting.
Yeah. Weird song. Waiting So Long, we also didn't talk about, is just completely mumble sung, which is amazing. Crazy choice. I fucking love it. But let's move on and talk about the absolutely outstanding voice cast for Berserk 97, that it was just a heathenous act to recast in later works, because oh my god, the cast for this show is so good. There are many characters and actors we could talk about here. I want to focus right now, Sean, on the main three, because this show is very much about three characters. Guts Griffith Casca. As Guts, we have Kana Nobutoshi, who we've talked before about because he is the Cuckoo Lane version of Lancer in Fate's Day Night. He is Kabuto in Naruto. He is the Japanese voice of Knuckles the Echidna in the Sonic universe. He is Toski in Fushigi Yugi. And he is the perfect Guts. Just absolutely perfect. There is something about the kind of... Because Kana is more on the character actor side of things when you look at his list. He's very rarely the lead. And I think that's kind of who Guts is. Guts is not your natural leading character. And there's this roughness to his vocal quality. And the way he is able to transform that over 25 episodes into the much more refined, articulate, eloquent Guts, who is a very soul-searching character, and who even is able to deliver, I think, one of the most, like, powerfully romantic lines of dialogue I've ever heard in the sex scene with Casca, where he says, "I haven't held you long enough yet." Like, the way Guts vocalizes that, it's impossible for me to hear anyone else as Guts. This is just such a casting made in heaven. I think he's tremendous.
Yeah, it's an amazing performance. Because again, like, I've read the manga, but I had no kind of like preconceived notions of what Guts sounds like. And it took me a second to adjust to it. I think in episode 1, it wasn't as kind of like deep a voice as I was expecting. And I think I knew that it was Kana Nobutoshi, but I didn't like have that in my head when I started sitting down to watch it. And so I was expecting something a little bit deeper. But then when you go to the flashback and I'm kind of reminded, like, right, this is like Guts when he's still very young. Because in my head, Guts is kind of where you leave him off much later in the manga, where he's what I referred to earlier as Daddy Guts. He's got like some kind of white hair from using Berserker armor too much. He's like, looks much older, even though that not much that time has actually passed. He's not actually literally that much older, but you know, he's been through some shit. He's aged, and he's got a bunch of people with him that look up to him, that he's the kind of leader of this group, especially a lot of younger people who maybe, you know, don't remember as much about like the world before it got fucked up by these demons. And so Guts in that capacity is kind of what I remember as this much older feeling version of the character. But when you go back to really young Guts, and Kana Nobutoshi has just like the perfect energy for this, like that really scrappy young kid who the only thing he's ever known is fighting and killing. And that's all he can do. And he's just, you know, he's a fucking naked sword, you know, like anything that tries to touch him, he will just cut down immediately. And he's incredibly raw and hurt. And then slowly, as you're saying, he kind of builds up himself into this really articulated, fully realized whole person, like the most complete person of any character in the show, where he kind of reaches an almost like Enlightenment-esque state at a certain point when he decides to leave Griffith and pursue himself. And he becomes this kind of like wandering martial artist with this very kind of pure existence. And that arc that Kana Nobutoshi traces with his voice, where he always has that gruff, powerful energy, because he's still Guts. He's still got to like go fucking crazy and kill 100 people. But finding that humanity and that like kind of the like, you know, nascent philosopher deep down inside of Guts that is an essential part of his character, that becomes much more apparent the deeper and deeper you go into the show or the series on the manga side. I think like the way he traces that arc with his voice is so elegant. And yeah, it's just an amazing performance. It's one of my favorite performances of this type in any anime. And it's like very clear to me that like this is why they cast him as Kukulin / Lancer for Fate Stay Night. Partially like the character designs, like Kukulin is just like a very slim Guts. He's got almost the exact same hairstyle, just blue. He's got a little bit of like a rat tail as well in the back, but the front is just totally Guts. And you know, he brings that, you know, same kind of energy to Lancer, but being able to see him articulate that kind of performance, but for this whole protagonist role where you see the depth and character growth, it's a real joy. And it does have that sensation of when you watch a movie that's kind of featuring an actor that you've normally seen more of as a character actor, and giving them like the full spotlight and getting to see them kind of fully express a range of what they can do that being a supporting character doesn't always afford the actor. And that's what this performance really like felt like. And as a fan of stuff that he's worked on for a long time, it was really cool getting to watch and experience his version of Guts. Because now it is, while I'm reading the manga, this is now the only voice I can hear in my mind. Like it is just, this is the voice of Guts completely. I don't think I would be able to watch the newer version, which I've definitely heard because I've seen clips of, but I can't like place it in my head anymore because this is just totally overridden whatever that voice is, and I just can't. I don't know if I'd ever be able to get past it.
Yeah, Sean, I completely agree. In the later anime versions, the voice of Guts is Iwanaga Hiroaki. It was his first voice role and really one of his only ones ever. He's mainly a tokusatsu actor. And I think this of both the Guts and Casca and later stuff, they're much more generic voices. Like, it's actually, I was flipping through stuff in the Golden Age trilogy last night, and it was actually a rare case where I flipped over to the dub and actually thought those voices were better, because the dub of the Golden Age arc uses the same dub voices from Berserk 97's dub, so those actors bring kind of a weight to it that the new Japanese actors didn't really have, and I thought that was interesting. So yeah, weird choice to recast, but Kana Nobutoshi, perfect. Equally perfect, just extraordinary here, is Morikawa Toshiyuki as Griffith, an actor best known as Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII, who almost certainly was cast as Sephiroth because of this, right, Sean? Like, because Sephiroth didn't have a voice yet until the 2000s, at which point they would have known, well, let's just get Griffith because Sephiroth is kind of Griffith.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just like Sephiroth is so clearly inspired by Griffith. Yeah, when I believe it would have been for Advent Children is the first time they would have gotten that voice cast. And they're just like, fuck it. Let's just get Griffith and have him be Sephiroth. Whatever, especially because he's got such a small role in that movie. You just need a very easy to associate performance to go with that.
But Morikawa is still Sephiroth, obviously, in like the Final Fantasy VII remakes and all that stuff.
Yes.
He was also the voice of Jinochi in Yu-Gi-Oh! 98, which we talked about a couple episodes ago. Great performance as Jinochi. Ubuyashiki in Kimetsu no Yaiba. Dante in the Devil May Cry universe. Naruto's dad, Minato, or Boruto's grandfather, we should say, in Naruto.
Yes,
Ichigo's dad in Bleach. And then there is also, we should note, young Griffith in this show, who has a really big scene in the penultimate episode, is voiced by Takayama Minami, who is the voice of Conan in Detective Conan. And like, that scene is so key. It is basically you're having someone come in and pinch hit the end of Griffith's arc in the show. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, they got like basically the best actor at that kind of thing they could get. And she's great as well. But Morikawa as Griffith is so stupendous. And I actually think this is a case where one of the funny things is that the recast of Griffith later on for the other anime is Sakurai Takahiro, who we also love. He's the voice of Cloud in Final Fantasy, so they just did this whole Cloud Griffith switch. But, you know, I've heard some of his stuff as Griffith, and I love Takahiro, or Sakurai, sorry. Great voice actor. But there's something about the way he voices Griffith that's similar to where he voices other characters, where he's very aloof. And I actually think the key to Morikawa's performance as Griffith is that, yes, Griffith is a certain degree of aloof because he is a little unreachable. We very rarely see his interiority the way we do other characters, and he is mysterious. But there is also something immediate about him. There is something very human about Griffith. I think that the engine that Berserk 97 and this part of the manga runs on is the question of what Griffith is, and are the things he ultimately does inevitable, or was he someone else at some other point? And I think the way Morikawa straddles that line, where Griffith is both a mystery and a person you feel like you can reach out and touch and be a friend to, the way Guts does early on, is a magic trick. And I don't know if I'm even explaining this well, but there's just something about the way he threads that needle that I think even other very, very talented actors couldn't do, and it is just tremendous.
Yeah, I mean, it's for, I obviously have not seen a lot of, though I do remember seeing specifically this clip from the Golden Age movies, like a long time ago. This was not like right before this podcast, but seeing the clip of Guts and Griffith having the duel where Guts wins, and seeing that with that voice cast. And like Sakurai is very good, but he's like exactly the voice I kind of expect Griffith to have, right? Like if I'm reading the manga, sans having now this cast in my mind, that is just that would be like my fan cast actor for Griffith, because it's like the kind of character that Sakurai Takahiro plays all the time, and that slightly like more kind of effeminate but very like powerful and mysterious, like that's just like a thing that he does extremely well. He plays villains very, very well, but it is like, but it's one of those things where it feels like a casting made thinking of him becoming a villain, right? Like that's kind of like the energy that casting has, whereas like Morikawa, obviously, now we have like him thinking of him as Sephiroth, but you would not associate him as being a primarily villainous actor. In fact, I think of him more as generically playing one of the good guys, is kind of like where he's more often typecast. Obviously, Sakurai plays lots of good guys too. But Morikawa's performance as Griffith feels like, I think what kind of you're saying, where there's more of a sense that there was a version of events where maybe Griffith did not have to end up like this. And I don't know if like the Sakurai version would give you that level of ambiguity, whereas like Morikawa the kind of voice that he has and the quality that he has is just a little bit more grounded. He sounds more like a regular person, or there's like a regular person inside there, and it's less of a heightened voice. That really sells that. Now that I think also it's the casting, I think it is also the style of the voice direction that this series goes for. This is one of those Dezaki Osamu influences that I feel in it, is that there is a like, the way that they present the voices in the audio mix is very kind of like raw, and it sits, I feel like, really intimately with the audience, and it has this almost theatrical pseudo radio play quality of, I think, where they put it in the overall mix, and it feels like they're instructed to play it a little bit more kind of real and less kind of heightened anime, and that feels like the kind of approach given in the direction. That's also, I think, just true of the way that they use the music and all that kind of stuff. Just feels like it is in this more theatrical kind of space to give a lot of audio the kind of like empty space for the audience, and it really heightens every individual element. And that's the style they're going for, and I think that really works so well with the approach they're taking for like the characters and the take on the characters, and getting that level of ambiguity, getting that level of humanity through in the performance by keeping it so grounded and so raw. And so Morikawa Toshiyuki as Griffith, I think, just makes use of all of that so perfectly. And it's a really beautiful performance that is not quite the like voice I would expect Griffith to have reading the manga, but I think that that's the right choice, because it gives you that sense of that there is another part of this guy that could be there if things had worked out differently, potentially if he was stronger and made different choices and saw things from like a bigger picture point of view, that he would not have gone down this path. And it gives you that kind of hope. And it kind of feels like you get to see Griffith more the way that Guts tries to see Griffith, and less the way that with the Sakurai kind of voice, I think you just inevitably see him as eventually he becomes Femto, eventually he becomes the bad guy. That's what like the larger story of Berserk is. And here you're more just living in the moment with that person.
The moment that I compared last night while I was skipping through the Golden Age trilogy, because it's probably my favorite Morikawa moment in 97, is this would be in episode 20, at the very end of 24, where you have Guts gets up to where Griffith is with the God Hand, and he's been told, if you say, I sacrifice them, you will become Femto, basically. And Griffith looks back at Guts. This series of pages in the manga is just breathtaking. And he thinks about it. It's a very simple set of lines where he basically says, you were the one, you were the only one I would have given up this dream for. And then it cuts to him finishing the line, basically, I sacrifice. And the way Morikawa plays that breaks my fucking heart, because I think it's completely heartfelt. Like, this was something that was clarified for me reading the manga, and it's there in the anime too, but there's just some extra scenes. Griffith loves Guts, is in love with Guts. And you can read that homoerotically, you can read it platonically, but he is in love with this man. He loves him deeply and dearly, to a degree he doesn't even understand. And Morikawa imbues that line with this is his last moment where he is human before he gives it all up. And the way he plays that breaks my heart. And I'm not saying this to bring down Sakurai, who is a great actor, but the way Sakurai reads that line is the first lines of a villain, like in that kind of flat delivery. And it doesn't hit. And I also think like that scene in that movie is directed because that movie is like, we don't have time, move, move, move. It doesn't get to slow down there the way the show does. But like that to me kind of defines how Morikawa does it. And my God, it's breathtaking.
Yeah, and I think it's not like this person is a better actor than this other person. It's like the approach of the casting and the conceptualization from that point of view. Like it's what I think it's what you're going for with the character. And Morikawa is just like a very interesting choice that I think is emphasizing different things in the character than I think you would expect. And that's where kind of going, not fully like it's not necessarily going against type or something, but just going a little bit outside of the kind of expected box, where again, Sakurai Takahiro is just like, if you showed any random person who's an anime fan this character in a couple of scenes of them and is like, pick an actor that would play this character, like 100% of them would pick him. Like, it's like, it is the kind of character he plays. And obviously that would not have been the case in 1997. but but Morikawa would not be just sort of the generic choice for a Griffith in 1997.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a really good piece of casting. It's an amazing piece of like on the part of the directors and all of that, of how they're conceptualizing having all of the characters and using those performances. It's so good. And I think it just really, I do think it like gives a really strong take on Griffith that is very simpatico with what the manga is doing, but it also like is giving you, because of the voicing and the music and all that kind of stuff, it's giving you different additional information to give you a stronger, different kind of lens on that character that heightens more of that, like what I think is their homoerotic love. Like he is in love, like he's romantically, the way I read it, he's romantically and sexually in love with Guts, and he doesn't know that, and he doesn't know how to express that, and that is definitely in the manga. But you know, and I need to reread the sections of the manga, but I don't remember it being as potently obvious as in this show, where it feels like that to me is like so powerful and so overwhelming about the character that, like you said, in that scene, it's so heartbreaking that he is maybe acknowledging it to himself for the first time. At the moment, he's also choosing to sacrifice it. And yeah, it's just a super strong take on the character, top to bottom.
And equally so with our third piece, because these main three are just all out of this world. And so our last one is Miyamura Yuko as Casca, someone we've talked about many times. She is most famous probably for playing Asuka in Neon Genesis Evangelion. This is where she would have just come off of that, obviously, doing Berserk. She's also Toyama in Detective Conan, Chun-Li in all the different versions of Street Fighter. And also, this blew my mind to learn. I did not learn this until doing the research for this thing, Sean. She is the peppy woman on the video who introduces the rules of the game in the Battle Royale movie. Is one of her only live action parts. She is the woman who explains to the kids how they're going to have to all kill each other. I did not know that. It blew my mind. That is awesome. She is a perfect Casca. I don't know what else to, equally, whatever we said about the other two, it's the same here. There is just, and it's funny because it's a fairly similar performance in some ways to how she plays Asuka in Neon Genesis Evangelion. I mean, obviously her voice is still in a very similar register from that time period, but there's a youth to it, there's a strength to it, the way she is able to play, because Casca has a huge arc of change in this as well. The leadership version of Casca that is in the end of this show that is pretty abbreviated from what we see in the manga, but I think the voice more than compensates for that. The, romantic moments, the quiet moments. The thing you're talking about, Sean, with the kind of radio stage direction kind of thing, I hear in her voice a lot too. There's just so much expressiveness to it. Absolutely definitive take on the character to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have those scenes in the middle of the show when Guts and Casca have fallen off the cliff and they're alone. This is one of, I think, the most memorable parts of the Golden Age arc. And you just have, this kind of heart-to-heart with these two people who have been at odds for the entire series up to that point. And that's where you get, I think, most distinctly that feel of, there's just, no music, there's no sound effects. It's just two actors, of what feels like super uptight on the mics, and the mix is brought in super intimate, and just getting that experience to the point where you wouldn't want to do this because the art is so good, but you could just close your eyes and just listen to the voices and listen to the performances as this little kind of radio duo performance, and it's so strong. I just think that aspect of the entire direction I love, and it really helps with Casca as well, because while she definitely, she's in the same place of her voice as she uses when she plays Asuka, right? She's obviously the same age and everything as when she originally played Asuka for Eva, but there is more grit there, right? There's this longer lived experience. There's a little bit more age there in the voice and the performance as well, which I think that Miyamura Yuko really brings out, and it just makes this Casca performance really strong and very, very memorable. So yes, all three actors, just phenomenal work as our three leads here.
In terms of other voices, there's many. I'm going to move on. I'll shout out a couple. Ishizuka Unsho as the narrator, who also plays Void, one of the God Hand at the end. Amazing. Having Ishida Akira as Judo, one of our favorite actors. He's authored in Gundam Seed, Kaworu and Eva, all of that stuff. The main character in Persona 3. You've got Genda Tesho as Adon, the general who recurs actually more than he does in the manga in the anime. All of that stuff. Utsumi Kenji as Nosferatu Zod. And finally, Wakamoto Norio as Gambino, Guts' adopted father. That is, just yet another Wakamoto Norio performance that we've run into this season, and another very memorable one, because he plays that dirtbag piece of shit very well.
Yes, I chuckled to myself a little bit when that popped up in the first flashback, just because it's like, how many fucking things has he been in that we've watched? It's not, like, at some point we could have renamed it the Wakamoto Norio anime tour or something. It's just like random Wakamoto Norio fucking shows that he's been in, because he's in like most of the things we've covered somehow.
Yes. So again, great cast. If some of them come up in the second half of today's show, we can continue talking about them. But for now, Sean, do you want to move on and get into our main discussion of the series itself?
Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about some fucking Berserk. Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can also find us over at the Purely Academic Podcast, our potentially educational variety show where we talk video games, movies, TV, and more every month. And you can read my movie reviews and follow everything we release together on the Fade to Lack Substack at www.jonathanlack.com.
And now, back to the show.
So, Sean, I have a whole list of notes here on the adaptation, and I think we can go through that in a bit because it might help us go through some of the major story beats. Because, again, I do think this is a really interesting adaptation. But let's start with the 30,000-foot view. Obviously, this is not a show where we're going to go episode by episode and do, here's episode 1, here's episode 2, because it is a serialized story. But I've been talking a lot. I will give it over to you. How would you define this show, what makes it great? Obviously, we also just have to talk about the story of the Golden Age itself, which is the same in any incarnation and is brilliant. But where do you want to start talking about Berserk?
Yeah, there's, I think, a lot of things that this production does extremely well. Just like to start with like a couple of like basic things that before it hits on like the big story, but I just think is like, kind of real meat and potatoes stuff that the series does incredibly well is how it like paces out and teases out the story and chunks it up, right? This is a show that just always has like this really strong sense of structure where each individual episode is a really good meaty chunk of story that feels like it gives you like a full kind of chapter in the story that has a beginning, middle, and end. And then it's, it's got like the canny choice to always end with that. And then here's one extra thing. Like here's that sort of gesture to where the next episode is going to go. And it's a really great replication of some of the way that the manga feels, where it's just a hard show to put down. Like I had to force myself multiple times to just consciously stop watching the show, or I would have finished watching through the whole thing like a week before we recorded, which is never what I want to do. I always want to have it like relatively fresh. And so like I had to make constant choices to be like, I'm going to watch this chunk of episodes and I'll take a couple of days and do this chunk of episodes, because it's just like so absorbing. You just get lost in the narrative, the world, the characters and their drama so completely. And that is a feature of the manga as well. When I first read through the manga, I just like ate it all the way up. And because it is that like ultimate kind of expression of fantasy genre where you feel like you just enter another world and you lose sight of like who you are and where you are and all of your stuff. Like you are here in Midland with Guts and the Band of the Hawk and going on this adventure. And it just like wraps you up in that so tightly and completely. And the anime replicates that experience so fully with all the different elements of the production it has to do that an anime has that a manga is not going to be able to use, right? So like that's where the music, the editing, the like animation style, the background art and all that, the acting, all of those things coming together with the writing and how they've chunked out and designed each individual episode on that kind of meat and potatoes, like, is this a fun and engaging show to watch level, purely on that dynamic, it's so strong. It's like more so than I was expecting. Like, I was kind of taken aback by how like quickly and easily I just got swept up into everything and had to like constantly keep on hitting on the brakes and be like, I cannot just watch another episode. I've got fucking work tomorrow. I cannot be done with this show so quickly. And so there is just on that like lizard brain element, this show is so fucking good. And it is, not the kind of, fancy pants stuff that we always talk about, but is something I think really worth remarking of everything that we have watched so far for the Grand Tour. This is I think the most entertaining show on that level, the most well-structured in that sense. Not everything we watched is episodic or serialized in quite this way, so they're not all going for that. But if in that sense of like how hard of a show is this to put down, this I would put at the top of the list of everything we watched. And I thought that was part of the design of the show that's very, very effective.
I would totally agree with that. And like the episodic quality is important to talk about because we've come a long way from Dragon Ball GT at the start of this season, Sean.
Yes.
Where one of your critiques of GT that I thought was very canny was that show is just chemically incapable of doing more than one thing an episode. It can just express one plot beat, one idea, if there's an idea, one thing. And, Berserk, this is 25 episodes. Every episode is capable of doing a lot of different things. But, like, the magic of good episodic serialized storytelling like this is being able to feel like you've gotten a big narrative experience in 25 minutes while also feeling like there was one central through line of that episode, right? And I think, like, this show is very good at that. If each episode does feel like an individually structured put together piece of art while also gesturing towards the next phase of the story, while also getting through a lot of story. I mean, again, the Golden Age section of the manga is really long. It is 10 full volumes, and Berserk volumes are 250 pages, not 200. And they're trying to do that in 25 episodes. Now, show could really do that because you would have to... I mean, the standard for like a 2-course season would be maybe 6 volumes, and that's like using the 200-page mark. So they're having to make a lot of sharp adaptation decisions that we'll talk about later. But one of the things that I think is most remarkable is how this show never feels rushed. It's 25 episodes, and it feels like it's able to get through a lot of story. It's able to move, at a good pace. But it also never feels like it is barreling you along because, oh my God, we got a lot of manga to get through. I mean, it makes some very specific decisions on what it does and does not adapt in a way that is more... I think, smart and thoughtful and engaged with the material than you often see of, anime adaptations of popular manga that tend to go pretty page by page.
Yeah, and this can't afford to do that, but that makes it stronger because it's that combination of we get enough for our episode to make it feel complete. We also leave space for it to slow down because the style of the show is slow, just like with the manga, particularly at this point. It is paced very leisurely in that it gives you lots of space to sit with the characters, lots of quiet moments with the characters. You have multiple episodes of the show where, not a lot happens on the sense of not every episode of the show is Guts killing 100 people. You have episodes where, very few or if any people die and you don't have huge amounts of action. Where there's lots of, quiet and kind of that quiet before the calm before the storm sort of idea. And you have all of that, but then you also just have that, that tantalizing thread of you always feel like there's something happening. There's something just on the horizon, to pull you along that either is horrifying or there is a hope there. And that to me is such an essential experience of Berserk, that it's such a propulsive series, even with its more leisurely pace, because you always have something that's pulling you forward, and that gesture towards the future that the series constantly has. Obviously, part of that is it has the frame device of that eventually everything's going to go to shit because eventually everything has to catch up to what happens in episode 1. Slash in the manga, you have that entire first opening arcs that that's a little bit more involved, and then you do your flashback stuff, and eventually all this is going to go to shit. But it gives you these moments of hope where you can kind of see a better future, and you see Guts growing and evolving, and the pacing of all of that and the tantalizing nature of the plot threads. I mean, this is why when I was reading the manga, I kept on following it, even with its sporadic, every couple of months a random chapter will come out thing, up until the point that I could get what felt like a reasonable piece of catharsis and closure with Casca being healed, because it was like there was just a part of my heart that was just always with Berserk and always with these characters, because I loved them so much and I loved the world so much that it needed that extra tiny piece of catharsis for me to be able to actually let it go. I think it's also why I find it hard to believe that somebody would be able to watch the show and enjoy it and then not immediately be looking like, okay, how do I get the manga? Like, how do I find out what happens next? Like, I need to, as complete as the show does feel like it gets to tell the story it wants to tell, I think, like, you, the audience, are not ready to let it go. It's maybe also why, like, Miura's death felt so particularly harsh, was like, you just don't want to walk away from it. You don't want to walk away from these people in this world. And that's the thing that the show, I was just, like, taken aback by how well it replicated that. And it, like, immediately put me back in, like, my bed in the condo with my laptop reading through chapters of Berserk, just being like, I know I gotta go to bed, but I'm just gonna do one more chapter. And this show just captured that energy so perfectly. And it's one of the things that makes it such a great adaptation, because it is not doing it the same way the manga did it. It is using other tools and using its, like, the way that it's cut down the show in specific ways, but still producing that same effect. It's really, really remarkable.
And I'm going to be honest. I think this is a difficult comparison to make. The show is 25 episodes, manga much bigger. For the part that it is adapting, I actually think the show is an improvement in some crucial ways. And that's not to put down Miura or the Golden Age arc or anything, and maybe improvement is even the wrong word. But I do find the anime to be an even more powerful experience. And that is not, again, to put down the manga in any way. But the manga version of the Golden Age is quite a bit more sprawling. It has a lot more action. Mm-hmm. It has a lot more of the sort of, eldritch horror, Hieronymus Bosch stuff coming into the world in its second half. And a lot of that stuff is still interesting. Some of it is not. I think the worst part of Berserk that I've read is in that half where you get the character Wild, who is just an awful character that they have to fight. And there's too much sexual assault in that part of the show, or in that part of the manga, all that stuff. But the thing that the anime does, and this is a thing that a good adaptation can often do, and can make an original work feel even more powerful to you, is it can hone in on what is the core idea of this thing, and let's whittle it down to that. And this is such a teachable example of that to me, because I think everything that is good in the anime, Berserk 97, is taken from the manga in some way or form. But what it has done is it has taken the big ideas of this section of the manga and I think narrowed them into this core set of themes with this core set of characters, where it is a three-hander with Guts, Griffith, and Casca, and it is a story about abuse and trauma. These are all characters who have been abused and traumatized in one way or another. In the manga, it is explicit that two of the three of them are victims of sexual assault. Guts as a child, Griffith as a young man. Casca, an almost victim of sexual assault, who Griffith rescues. And that is how she becomes loyal to him as a young person. And it is a story about these three people bouncing off each other and sharing their abuses and traumas, in some ways getting over it, but then ultimately, because of the choices Griffith makes, succumbing to it. And what that does to a person and what kind of state that puts you in. And I think the show is just so smart in how it chooses to zero in on those ideas, to really focus on the concepts of abuse and trauma that these characters have, and to make the show structurally, both episode by episode, but also in terms of the whole 25-episode experience, about those ideas. The choice to end at the exact moment where Griffith, in the new form of Femto, is assaulting Casca. Guts is literally tearing his body apart to try to get to her, and we cut to black. Soprano-style ending, as you said, Sean. I remember the first time I saw this show, and I didn't know how it was going to end, and I hadn't read the manga or anything. It blew me away. And I was sitting there staring at the wall, and the only thing I could think to do to try to figure out how to make sense of it was just put disc 1 of the Blu-ray in again and start the show and watch episode 1. And I think the structural thing this show does, I realized, is it's a Mobius strip. It is the way it has structured itself, because the actual Golden Age arc in the manga continues and fully articulates and connects very neatly by the end to the Black Swordsman stuff, so we can continue the story. And instead, what this is doing is this kind of oblique, almost like David Lynch's Lost Highway or something, where it starts and ends at the same point, where it starts with this episode where Guts is this, miserable person, black swordsman. He's a badass, but he's a miserable bastard, going around killing people, killing demons, torturing them as he does it, and just feeling bad about the world because the world is very dark. And then he starts to remember the Golden Age, and that memory carries us through episodes 2 to 25 to the point of ultimate trauma. And then if you put episode 1 on again, it is the next stage of that story, but then it brings you right back into it. And I think the way the show replicates the experience of being in a traumatic cycle and being in a cycle where it is hard to find a way out of whatever torments you, and that can be abuse, it can be other kinds of post-traumatic stress, any kind of trauma like that, and the way it affects your relationships with people, the way it affects your relationship with yourself, the way it is kind of a Mobius strip where you can get out of it and go right back into it, and everything leads back to that moment. Like, it is a thing that I've never seen another show try to attempt something like this. It is a different kind of structure than what the manga goes for, and it is where, like, this show does feel complete to me, even though it has what is in some ways a rough cliffhanger ending because it just cuts. But it feels complete because that is the moment the story that they are telling ends. It is the moment where Griffith has completely given in to his trauma, and in so doing is re-traumatizing Guts and doing to Casca the thing that he had rescued her from once. And the way it brings that to a close and just says, no, that's the actual ending of the story we're telling. Everything else is epilogue. I think it's just brilliant.
Yeah, because it's a thing where, like, what the manga is doing, right, is it has its eye on a much, much bigger picture story that, like, the story of Berserk, from the manga's perspective, to me, is a story of Guts trying to find a way to live in this world when the scales have fallen from his eyes and he sees, like, that, like, the personal horrors of his own history are made manifest across the entire world, and everybody is blind to it, right? Everybody else hails Griffith / Femto as being like this messianic-like figure, and Griffith and his kind of band of misfits that he brings together are like the only people who really understand the horrors that are happening here. And so it is about, like, Guts having to sort of figure out a way forward in that world, and how do you, like, for you and the people near you, put the pieces together when everything else has gone to shit. And how do you try to be or become a good person? How do you live with yourself in that world? Right? That's what that story is really about. And all the Golden Age stuff is about setting up, how do we get to this point? Like, who are these people? What was the world? What is, like, the quote unquote Golden Age, right? That Guts remembers as kind of like happier time, but that was just a sort of like veil over a thing that was always here. Nosferatu, Zod, and the demons and all this shit was always there. It was just behind a curtain and he couldn't see it yet. And now it's all ripped off and it's manifest and he can't escape it, and it's hunting him and haunting him literally in his dreams. And like, how can he live with that, and how can he heal the people around him and all that? Like, that's the bigger story of the manga Berserk. So there's a lot of stuff in the Golden Age arc that this series does not adapt that is essential material for telling that story. But that's not the story the anime is trying to tell, because it does not, it's not going to be hundreds of episodes long. Obviously, at that point, the manga was, the manga is still not finished. It was far, far from finished in 1997. You don't know how much, like, road you have ahead of you there. So I think it was very smart to say, like, we're going to do a 2-core show, and we're going to tackle this, like, relatively self-contained section of the manga, because you can't really, I think, reasonably rip out those later arcs and make them their own show as cleanly, because they don't have, like, an ending spot. They just lead them to the next part of the story. Whereas the Golden Age arc, because it has that Mobius loop effect, because it is going to come back to this, like, beginning point that leads into it, it does have, like, a clear definitive ending where then it can be its own self-contained thing that hands off a story to the next part to say, like, here is, the larger story of Berserk. If you want to see that, go read the manga. Or maybe they thought, like, maybe one day we'll be able to do another show. Who knows? Or go fucking get the Dreamcast game, whatever. But that is such a smart thing for the show to tackle this specific chunk of the story that it can handle. And then, as you say, whittle down all the other stuff and narrowly focus in on what are the essential parts that this part of the story needs to have and tell, and how do we do that as effectively as possible. And it's about the best version of that you could possibly imagine. Like, I was very shocked by the point at which it ends. Again, even obviously knowing all the story, not shocked by like the events that occur. I was shocked by the events that occurred 13 years ago when I originally read them. But just shocked by the brutality of how suddenly it stops with, you know, Guts getting his eye gouged out and blood just dripping over from the top of the frame. And then it just goes to, been waiting so long. You're like, oh shit, okay, God. And then, you know, then you obviously you do get at least that little post-credit scene that is the thing that then leads you into, I didn't actually watch the first episode again because it was like 1 a.m. last night. It's like, I got to go to bed. But like it makes you want to do that. It makes you want to see the beginning again, to see how this all hooks back in. And yes, the way that replicates that sense of like the cycles is very powerful. That's a thing that the larger manga of Berserk does deal with, because there are bigger historical cycles with the God Hand, and there's the Skull Knight, and there's like a lot of that kind of stuff. But it's like a much, much bigger version of that concept. Whereas the show is like, how can we bring those ideas of cycles of abuse and bring it into just like the container that we have here? And it's, this is the thing that makes it such a phenomenal piece of adaptation, it knows exactly how much it can bite off from the original, and it knows how to kind of whittle down and fashion that section into a story that can stand on its own.
Yes, and this is helping me like figure out what I was trying to say earlier, which is that it's not like I prefer the anime over the manga or in some kind of overall form. What I'm saying is that like what it does for the Golden Age material specifically hits me even harder in this form. And part of it is because it is a standalone thing, and it found a way to make it a standalone story. Whereas, yes, in the manga, you finish the Golden Age arc, and you just want to keep reading on into its conviction, lost children, all of that stuff. And you want to keep going with it because it is just an ongoing story. And this is ultimately now it's about 1/4 of the overall length of the manga, right? But it is a fraction of the overall story. But this is the story of this show. And, you know, if they had gone on, there's nothing that wasn't adapted that they couldn't have reintroduced somewhere else, I don't think. Like, you could figure out another way to put Skull Knight into the story. My thought is that it would be pretty easy to make a season 2 of this show where you just start with, do the other Black Swordsman stuff, introduce Puck, get to the point in that arc where in the manga you meet the God Hand for the first time, and then go back and do the very end of the Golden Age, because you'd at that point like show how he got away the first time, and then keep moving on, and you could do all of that. But I'm not saying that with like that was their intention in making it. It's just that they found a way to do it. If you only have 25 episodes to do a Berserk thing, here's how you do it, and you make it feel standalone and satisfying. Satisfying maybe being a weird word for a show that breaks your heart so fucking much, but it is narratively satisfying and revelatory.
Yeah, it feels like a complete expression of itself, which is a huge achievement, because that is not an easy thing to do, and that is the thing that like we have seen. If you've watched lots of anime, you have seen a lot of different versions of how does an anime adaptation try to tackle an in-progress manga story, and almost none of them do it as well as this. You know, like usually the best you can hope for is kind of like a lot of what we get with the modern model with something like Kimetsu no Yaiba, where it's something that has the luxury to take breaks and then come back and adapt more of it later, and take the production in chunks so it can all be of like the same level of high quality. But otherwise you're like in weird like filler territory. You're in like the original Full Metal Alchemist show where they're like, fuck it, we just got to make a different thing at like a shockingly very early point in that, much earlier than people I think typically actually say. You know, like you're just in a very different world. And I'm very glad that this show is what it is, that you don't have the thing you have, for example, with another series like this, Claymore, which has a very good anime adaptation, nowhere near as good as this, but it's a good one. But it does end up getting to a point where they're like, and fuck it, let's just do 2 episodes that are totally made up nonsense, that don't really make any sense, that don't connect to where they deviate from the manga in any clear way, that don't actually give you a sense of like completion to the story because they don't connect cleanly, and you're just left with a bad taste in your mouth at the end of that show because it had been so fun and interesting and well done up to that point. And then even if you haven't read the manga, you know this is just some bullshit they've thrown together in order to have a conclusion to the series. And it's just so nice that Berserk is not that it gets to be a whole thing on its own. And you don't have to kind of like, you know, if you introduce this show to someone, you maybe have to preface some, like, it's got some extreme content in it, but you don't have to preface it with like, oh, but skip episode 5 because episode 5 is and the B part of episode 8, well, that's not really from the blah blah blah, and then episodes 25 and 26, well, you don't want to watch those. Instead, here, read these 2 chapters from the you don't have to do any of that shit. That is like the instinct of fans of certain series, you know, with like, you know, the Full Metal Alchemist thing. You don't have to be like, well, technically, I think the proper watch order is watch episodes 1, 3, 18, and 24 for Full Metal Alchemist, and then you can start watching episode 12 of Brotherhood. It's, you know, the bullshit conversations that people have online. None of that. You just say, the show, it maybe has some extreme material, so keep that in mind, but it's very, very good. Here is a 25 episode thing. Here is a Blu-ray set. Watch it. It's pretty fucking awesome, and that's it. And it's just really satisfying to have a show that's an adaptation of a series that is not done, that does it so fucking perfectly, because almost nothing else does it like this.
And it is so smart in its adaptational choices in making excisions that keep this version consistent unto itself. Let me give an example. I think the best thing in this stretch of the manga that is not in the anime is the through line about Guts' own experience with sexual assault. This is in the manga. The Golden Age actually starts with Guts' birth, where he is literally found in a pile of guts. That's why he's named that. I mean, they don't say that, but that's your assumption, right? Yes. And so he is brought in by this band of mercenaries and all this stuff. They adapt a little bit of this, enough to show you in the anime. They show you Gambino being an abusive father and Guts being forced to kill him, and this being kind of his foundational trauma. There's an additional side to that in the manga where Gambino was paid by another man in the mercenary band who raped Guts as a child. And it is understandable why the anime felt it could not adapt that. I mean, that is an incredibly loaded, obviously, set of images to do. Even today, I feel like that would be pushing it for certain late-night anime, right? Like, that's a heavy thing to deal with.
Oh, yes.
So they don't... And it's not like the manga shows it explicitly, but it makes it clear this is what happened. So there's this through line throughout the show, or throughout the manga, where Guts has several different hang-ups from this, obviously. He doesn't like being touched. Whenever anyone tries to grab him on the shoulder, you see this a couple times in the show, he is very reactive to that. He is not generally intimate with people. He has these intense flashbacks, which the show does in kind of a different way, but there's quite a few more of them in the manga, where he often sees fear in the form of the man who raped him. And when it comes back around to him and Casca becoming intimate and after the year time jump, and we've learned what happens to Griffith, and he comes back to the Band of the Hawk, and he and Casca make love, he has this moment where once he starts having sex with her, he has this basically traumatic flashback to what happened to him as a child, and for a moment he loses himself and he chokes Casca for a second. And then he backs off, and he finally, for the first time, unloads all of this on another person. And he explains what happened to him. He explains why he feels so complicated in his feelings about Gambino, all of that stuff. Casca helps him through it. Guts feels terrible about having tried to choke her for a second, but she understands because she's had her own traumas. They share, there's even this whole exchange about them admitting that both of them are virgins because... both of them have had these formative experiences with sex that were very scary and traumatizing to them. And it is incredibly mature and beautiful writing that uses sex in a way I've very rarely seen in any kind of media for narrative purposes that is so powerful and profound. Now, the show does very little of that. And in some sense, I think that's a loss because it is something that is so powerful to what the Golden Age is. But I also understand the content restrictions of why they couldn't. And when you look at how they did it, they're very careful about where they make those excisions. Basically from episode 2 all the way to episode 21, which is where that sex scene happens, to still tell a story, even though they can't tell the full story. So they're still able to show that Guts has a formative trauma. In the show, it is more directly physical abuse, and it is this way he was forced to kill at a very young age and then run away. Casca, they're still able to show that she was threatened with sexual assault. The manga does this quite a few more times in a way that I think gets a little too repetitive, but they're able to show that in the anime once or twice. And then they are able to show them coming together in this form of intimacy they haven't been able to achieve with anyone else. And that still feels like a full romance and relationship, and they're still able to show how Guts becomes a fuller, deeper person out of the fires of his trauma, all of that, while excising this thing that is, again, in the manga, absolutely brilliant writing. But for whatever, probably a content reason, not able to do it in the show, but still find a consistent way to make that excision so that the show feels full unto itself. And that is also something that I think is just really rare with these kinds of adaptations. Often, if there is something that is missing, it's just a glaring absence in the adaptation. Like, here's one of my favorite ones. This isn't even really a thematic thing, it's just a plot thing. One Piece, the anime, the Toei anime, has never depicted how Luffy got the scar on his cheek that is there in every frame of his animation. And it's because in Chapter 1, he was trying to prove to the other pirates, the Shanks and his crew, that he was tough, and he cuts himself. And they cut that out because they thought it was too brutal. But it becomes this, glaring absence. They didn't explain elsewhere how he got the scar. This is a weird thing they did, right? And I feel like you get that a lot, where there's just a piece missing of the story, but this show finds a way to tell a story, even if it's not the exact story the author told.
Yeah, and I also feel like it is able to, do, imply certain things that it can't directly show, right? Because you do have, in the first couple of episodes, you have, one of those dream sequences that, young Guts has. This is right before I think this is after he gets knocked out and kind of is jumped into the Band of the Hawk, basically. And he has that dream sequence where he sees a naked Gambino standing on a pile of bodies, and then this specter of a demon-like figure that comes and kind of overwhelms Guts, and Guts is also naked in the dream. And you get him having these very harsh reactions to being touched, that you don't have to be Sigmund Freud to put together the symbolism of what is happening here, right? Even if the show is not able to explicitly indicate that this is what happened, they can't it doesn't speak to it directly. It does, through symbolism and imagery, give you the sense that that this is a thing that is there. It is not able to fully explore it or fully unpack it in the same way the manga did, but it feels like it's part of the DNA of the character still. It's still in there, and it still is resonant with all of the other themes that it is juxtaposed with. And so it is not just simply sort of carelessly excised because it's oh, well, we have to cut this out for content reasons. It feels like they found ways to still keep it alive in the heart of the story. It's just at a much more sublimated level than it is in the manga.
Yeah, I think that's true too. But again, it just speaks to, there's a thoughtfulness with it. It's not kind of a hack and slash, well, we can do these 5 pages, but not this 1 page, so let's cut that from the story, that kind of thing. And I'm not accusing every other adaptation of being lazy. I'm just saying, there's an extra level of care that you can see in the writing of this show of how to structure all of that. And it comes down to other things, that, technically, this is a very lopsided adaptation because the first 19 episodes are the first 5 volumes of the Golden Age, and the last 6 episodes are the other 5 volumes of the Golden Age. But that blew my mind when I read through the manga because it doesn't feel lopsided. It doesn't feel like the show hits a point where it's shit, we only got 6 episodes, let's hit the gas. It's very, again, smart about where it makes the excisions so that it feels consistent unto itself as a TV show.
Yeah, because a lot of the stuff it excises, based on what I remember, is a lot of it is stuff that's more setting up for the things that are going to come after the Golden Age arc. Because for instance, I remember there being, you get more of Guts and Casca as a couple, they're together for longer, which I think is really important because Casca is a character throughout the whole series.
Right.
She's one of the main cast, even post the Golden Age arc. She has, her psyche has been destroyed by what happened, but she is there. She's one of the most important characters. And so I think if that's what you're going to do, having more of Guts and Casca having been together to explain just why is Guts so attached to this relationship that he can't let her go. He will never let her go. She's the most driving force he has in his life. And she is this hope that he still has with him. As brutal as it is, there is still this hope that she can get better. And you want more of that time with those two characters together if that's the story you're eventually going to tell. But I don't think that you need that much additional material if you're going to take it to the point of where this show is doing. You still need that relationship to be important. You need to show what it has done for Guts and Casca, and also what it means and what Griffith sees in it. And that then can drive the choice that Griffith makes at the very end of the series, but you don't need like this much more expanded material. And so that's another place where I think all the cuts are very smart, because most of that back half of the Golden Age arc is, yes, is it contributing to things happening in the Golden Age? Yes, but it is also very much about building up the story that you are then going to continue on from after that point.
Yes, and let me, just while we're here, let's go into some of this a little bit more, because I think it's really interesting. The biggest thing they cut in this from the second half of the Golden Age arc, and from the manga overall, is basically once they break Griffith out of the Windham Castle in the manga, there's 2 volumes of battles that happen after that. And they cut almost all of that. The one thing they keep is basically they have the scene in the anime where they have a soldier come and expose Griffith to the whole group, so that's how the Band of the Hawk learns what has happened to his body. But that is, in the manga, that is part of, again, 2 solid volumes of battles, some of which I think gets very repetitive and feels a little aimless. But the reason I think Miura wrote all that is both because it's setting up some of the stuff with the Apostles and some of the future kinds of big action. It's Guts' first time beating one of those big Zod-style monsters in the character of Wild. But the real thing it's doing in terms of characterization there is it's giving you, as you just said, Sean, more time with Griffith Guts and Casca, but also it spends a lot of time characterizing Griffith after his torture, where you just see a lot of him as a person, how he's sort of still alive inside that helmet. And I think all of that stuff is very good. But I understand why they cut it, both because of time constraints, but also what is the main thing they are trying to express in the closing episodes of Berserk 97? It's not set up for a future fight. It's not necessarily Griffith as an ongoing, continuing character that Guts is going to encounter again in some form. It is this choice that Griffith is going to make. And so, in the manga, there's a very long time between when the characters discover Griffith's body has been destroyed this way, and when they are now able to take a breath and process that revelation. There's about 2 volumes, 500 pages of manga between those 2 points. The anime, I think, understandably wants to go from A to B there right away, because that's what the end of this show is about, and go from get him out of the castle to now everyone is grappling with what does this mean for us? What does it mean for him? Who are we now? And then Griffith having to encounter that as well, and why he makes the decisions he makes. And so those are the kinds of changes that, yes, if you were making the full, 500 episode adaptation of Berserk, some of that wouldn't make sense. But for this, it doesn't feel like they've suddenly excised 2 volumes of manga. Usually that would feel very rushed, because they're not trying to go. Also, they just cut them. They're not trying to do a shorter version of those 2 volumes. Yeah. They just move past it and reattach it in a different way. And that's also something I see anime adaptations often being pretty loath to do, because they want to get at least a little bit of everything in there. And this show is very kind of mercenary, where it makes the cuts. It's no, just we need to move on to the next thing and find a way to connect it in a way that works for this show.
Yeah, it just feels like it has such a vision of this is the ending that this show is going to be able to get to. What is most essential for that, and it is just so efficient at doing that, while also never. I think it's always important to emphasize how much that never feels like it harms the pacing of this show. It's not just excising stuff because it needs to rush through anything. It always knows exactly the amount of material that individual episodes can deal with. That's also the amount of material that you can get through to get you in an appropriate pace to the ending they're trying to arrive at. All of it is so perfectly paced, and so all of those cuts just feel very surgically precise to get you exactly the thing that the show needs in that moment.
Yes, it also means that they're able to spend their time on the first half of the arc, which is where all the character development happens, right? Yes. Once you get into part of why you don't do those 2 volumes of battles in this show is that, there's a little bit of stuff here and there, but for the most part, Guts, Casca, and Griffith are not changing and growing in those battles, whereas everything in those first 5 volumes is all about how they change and grow as characters, to the point that the anime actually adds 2 anime-only stories in this stretch, which it's been so long since you read the manga, Sean. I'm curious if you even caught these. No?
No, okay. I knew that they added some stuff, so I was vaguely I think maybe this is, but I would not have been able to confidently assert that they were original to the anime.
Yeah, it's in episode 5 where you have an additional little battle where it's where you first meet General Adon in the show, because in the manga, he just comes in for the first time in that battle with Casca where she goes off the cliff. But we have 2 additional Adon appearances in the show, and that is in episode 5 where he plants the, like, gunpowder kegs in the camp, and Guts rides forth to try to warn Griffith, which is basically following up on the sort of Guts-Casca conflict from the chapter that the first half of that episode is adapting, and trying to show that Guts does have some loyalty to this band. And I think it's a nice little piece of character growth. And then episodes 7 and 8, the very end of 7 into the first 2/3 of episode 8, is where they battle Sir Adon over this little castle. And they do the thing where they have the strategy where they go across the river and come around behind it. And it's a really good piece of writing that feels like something Miura could have written, but it is also very clearly a preview of the strategy they will use at Doldry later on, but at a smaller scale. And so those are 2 stories that they've inserted, which also means that Sir Adon and then General Boscone and Genon, the guy who assaulted Griffith, become kind of like recurring enemies who get dealt with at the same point in the story, and gives the show a little extra scaffolding of a shape around it. And so, like, in a very technical sense, you could call those 2 things filler. They are things in the anime that are not in the manga. They don't feel like filler whatsoever. I think, when I watched this without having read the manga, I had no idea that those were not parts in the manga. Whereas, if I'm watching Naruto, I can tell where they've put the filler in. It's not hard. I can figure it out. That is not what Berserk is doing.
Absolutely. Like, usually, anime original episodes are like, you just like, it has that certain smell, and like, you pause the episode and you're like, let me go to Wikipedia for a second. I'm like, yep, I thought so. No, again, like, I kind of like, I only suspected that maybe they were, because again, I knew that there was some stuff that they added in. And I was like, well, that's the only stuff it would be. But it fits so perfectly within the style of the show and the series that, like you said, it feels like a battle that Miura could have done if he had wanted to. Obviously, like, for the purpose of the show, like, it makes a lot of sense that you want more time with Griffith, Guts, and Casca in this kind of formative section, because if your ending point is this ending point with Griffith and the ritual, well, you need more of those 3 of them all together and further develop that. Whereas in the manga, your eye is on, eventually Guts is going to go around and murder demons. Like, that's where we're going. We need stuff that's going to set up that part so you have more fights in that second half where the demons start becoming more kind of like around, like, right there, like, even before the eclipse, there's like an emergence of more of these things. And you get a hint of that in the anime with the little part with Rickard, where he sees the not fairy thing that then gets all the monsters that kills that whole section of the Band of Hawks. But in the manga, it's like a bigger kind of notion that you need to set up more. And so, it's just all these choices are really, really sharp adaptational choices that again and again just show how well designed the show is. And maybe this is all, when we thought about that series concept advisor role that Imamura had, maybe this is what it is. It's like, these are all very good concepts for the series that someone would have to advise on. Who knows?
Well, it would make sense that maybe there's someone in that advisory capacity looking out for what, again, I would assume it's maybe in the kind of not exactly a series composer, but someone helping to, like, guide the narrative. Who the hell knows? But it does feel like very authored in that sense, with this very talented group of writers who are working in a singular degree of purpose. And, I think that brings us to just talking about this story itself. And obviously this is true of the manga as well. But what makes the Golden Age such a fucking rich, special story? And I was thinking about how to, phrase this. And I think one of the things, and coming back to what the show focuses on, which is that aspect of abuse, is that the Golden Age has all the trappings of being Game of Thrones. And in some ways, it even has the same plot points. I mean, Griffith is basically Daenerys from Game of Thrones, but done good, right? It is the beautiful person who could have saved the world, who instead damns it, right? He's even basically the Theon character who gets tortured within an inch of his life and then has to do something else. Like, it's got these parallels. But what I mean by Game of Thrones is the story about politics and an entire world and all these big battles and movers and shakers and who's going to end up on the throne. And Berserk has all the outside trappings of that, and cares about fucking none of it. Because what it actually is this story of the character psychology of these three people in this larger context and what happens to them. And then there's also this other side where it is doing this very cool thing where this is a world that seemingly to most of the people in it does not have fantasy, and then the fantasy comes out and is dark and horrific and overtakes the world by the end. So you have these kind of two things going on, where again, you can imagine the version of this that is more political, that is more about the king and the queen, and there actually is more of that in the manga. There's quite a bit more with the king and Princess Charlotte and all of that. But that's not really what is important. What is important is this very character psychology-driven story about these people who grow together. Some of them grow in positive directions, one of them grows in a negative direction. And it is also about, as the opening narration tells us over and over again, this question of fate and free will. And I think the other thing that is so masterful about the Golden Age in any form is how I've experienced 3 times now, 2 times with the show and once with the manga. And every time it has the character of any great tragedy, like a great performance of Hamlet or something, where you know how it has to end. You know exactly because it has told you. Or Romeo and Juliet might be an even better comparison because that starts with someone coming out on stage and telling you, these kids are going to fucking die. Now enjoy the show. And that's what this tells you too. This is all going to go to shit. Now enjoy the show. And yet, like any good tragedy, it feels contingent to you. There's that sense of contingency of these are real people who are moving and growing dynamically around each other. And you keep seeing and identifying what are the hinge points that actually caused things to go in this direction. How could they have gone differently? Does this feel inevitable to me or not? And I think part of the brilliance of the Golden Age, and I think the anime captures this brilliantly, is as much as we hear about fate and causality, it does not feel inevitable to me. It feels very dynamic and human.
Yeah, well, because I think there's at play these like two perspectives. There's this like big picture perspective, which is obviously what an entity like Void, the God Hand, who you find out at the end is the narrator voice that is telling you about the like, is it the will of God? Is there some supernatural power hanging over us? But there's one thing is for certain, is that that man is not in control of his own will, right? Like that notion is delivered to us by a literal devil, right? The head of the God Hand, the most powerful, the most ancient of them, Void. And from his perspective, you know, all these things seem inevitable because you are looking at like the broad strokes of history, of these broad strokes of cycles. You know, that's more like when you're reading Romance of the Three Kingdoms and you get your, you know, through the empires once united divide, once divided unite. So it is throughout antiquity that eventually the Han Empire will fall apart. Eventually something new will be built from the constituent pieces, and eventually what replaces it will fall, right? There's this like a big picture perspective looking at that. But from the perspective of the people living in this moment, it is all of these are the result of individual choices made in individual moments, informed by the characters' past and their history and their emotional states, but things where it feels so powerfully like things could go a different way if Guts could just see Griffith and Griffith could just see Guts. Like, that's really what it all feels like at the end of the day. If these two people could just have actually really understood each other for 1 second, because they never really do. You know, it's very Amuro and Char is very Guts and Griffith to me, where it's like, it's just, if only they could have really seen the world through each other's eyes for just a moment, everything would be fine. You know, in Gundam, the fucking, you know, we wouldn't be all dying trying to push this asteroid away from Earth. We'd all be working towards a better future. But it is just these two people who are so important to each other never really understand both how they themselves feel about the other person, nor how does the other person feel about themselves. And so it ultimately leads to this incredible tragedy. And yet in those moments, you're like, God, if just you said this one thing, maybe it all would be averted. And that's part of that power of the story.
Yeah. I mean, and let's talk about those characters, because it is, that interplay is just so fascinating and rich. And every time I go through this story, I find more points of nuance in it, more ways I understand these characters. The biggest change for me is every time I go back to it, it's how human Griffith feels. Because I think the first time you go through this story, you very much see Griffith through Guts' eyes, where he is someone, He is so beautiful and amazing, beautiful like inside and out, he feels, right? Like he is literally one of the most beautiful people in this world, but also like, oh my God, his dream is so big and he can get all these people together and he can make you feel powerful. For Casca, you see that too, that he can make you feel safe in a world that is absolutely not safe. He makes her feel safe and empowered and able to like make decisions and live in this world. And you see Griffith through that, and then his fall feels like such a betrayal. But then you see it again and you start thinking it through Griffith's perspective. And Griffith is this guy who he, because he is like beautiful and eloquent and all these things, he is also distant from people. And he has closed himself off to people because he has this fucking crazy dream he wants to have. And he does feel for people. There's that scene where Casca remembers after he gives his body to that lord, the pederast lord who basically rapes him. He's in the river, and Griffith is trying to pretend, and I think it's pretending, that this doesn't affect him, but of course it affects him, and he's ripping his arms apart as he's talking about this. And you also realize how much every death of someone in the Band of the Hawk affects him, because he feels he's carrying all this weight, and he has no one to share it with. And then this guy Guts comes along, and he is absolutely head over fucking heels in love for this man, in a way that he cannot understand, cannot admit to himself, cannot share. And he also can't see the effect he's having on this guy, where he is inspiring this person to grow beyond him in a way that actual love does when it is reciprocated. And he can only understand love through ownership. And so it becomes this, brutal cycle that ends with him taking Casca in the form of Femto away from Guts because he can only see the world through domination and ownership. And you can pick on these threads for any of these characters and go in these fascinating directions. And I think it just enriches every time because, and I do come back to that idea of like human contingency, because it is so about all of these dynamics are playing on very real human foibles and frailties that feel so immediate. They don't feel like something out of myth. They feel like, this could also be in a drama set today, and you could have a lot of these same ideas.
Yeah, like with Griffith, I think there's one thing where I have a little bit of an issue with this translation in the Discotheque release, where in some of the early episodes, you have the moment where they kind of jump Guts. Then Griffith decides that he wants him in the Band of the Hawk. They have the whole duel, all this stuff. And then Griffith gives him the speech where he says, I want you.
Yes.
Like, I want you. I want to own you. And in the English subtitles, they keep on like adding extra information where it's like, I want you to join the Band of the Hawks. Like they add additional context on there, which is understandable because oftentimes in Japanese, you remove, like, you don't always say things like explicitly, literally. You remove some of that like additional information because it's contextually given, and it's just like a feature of like the language and how it's communicated. And so it is often the right choice to make in translating Japanese to English to reinsert the contextually implied information, because English doesn't do that as much. English likes to spell things out more literally and more completely often. But this is an instance where I think it is like, it's very pointed that Griffith turns and smiles and looks Guts in the eyes and says, I want you. Like there is like this sense of like, I want and need you as a person. And again, my read is I don't think necessarily Griffith himself fully understands his own feelings towards Guts in those moments, but I do think it is a romantic love for Guts. That's like, that is what he feels, but he cannot admit it to himself. I think both because I think there's this homosexual quality to it, but also because it's like that means he has to let go of this dream, or it hurts his pursuit of his dream, that there is something so much more simple, human, and quaint in front of him that can bring him satisfaction, and that it does not have to be dominating the world through power and becoming a king and upturning everything, like the whole system of the world. It doesn't need to be all of that for him to be satisfied. Maybe it is just to find one person who he cares about, who he thinks he can understand him, and one person whom he can trust in completely. And maybe that's enough for Griffith. I think that idea terrifies him. And I think that's like the thing that all these people are looking for, because they're all hurt and they're all traumatized. And that is the thing that Guts and Casca find in each other that Griffith does not have. You have a lot of those very pointed moments. It's in the manga and it's in the anime where Griffith in his disabled body is there looking with his hawk's eye at Guts and Casca and them together and seeing in there the relationship that he himself always wanted with Guts but could never be honest about and never really pursue, which is, I think, one of the many, many things that leads to the choice he makes at the end of what he does and why he becomes Femto and what he does as Femto. But it is one of those just like really powerful parts of this structure of the story, the way they present it, is that Griffith being this more aloof figure means, I think, on your first kind of read through or watch through or whatever, it's hard to see or fully kind of understand exactly what it is that he's feeling for Guts. But the more you go through it, I think the more clear it becomes of how much he himself is ignorant of his feelings. And of course, Griffith is also ignorant of them until maybe the last few moments, as he starts to kind of put things together with what Casca is telling him. But yeah, it's a very just like powerful interplay between these two people who should be on the same kind of path, who empower and enrich each other and love each other in slightly different ways, but love each other so much. But at the same time, there is just this fundamental misunderstanding they can't overcome.
And it is that interplay between contingency, free will, and fate is so rich and fascinating here, because you can look at it and say, well, of course someone like Griffith, with like what we know about him, who he is underneath, all of those things, when he meets someone like Guts who fills those spaces within him and gives him a desire that is more immediate, concrete, human, loving than what his actual dream, which is basically this impossible idea of a kingdom and rulership and all this stuff, then of course ultimately that would tear him apart, and that feels like a move from free will to fate. And of course Guts, who is this person his whole central trauma is that he wanders from place to place with his sword. He is basically the Superman of this world. He can kill anything as long as he's got his sword on him, and you give him enough time to figure it out. But he doesn't have a purpose. He feels like he lacks a purpose with this, and then he meets this guy who overwhelms him with a sense of purpose. And because he respects Griffith so much in a way he's never respected anybody, makes him want to better himself. And in the act of bettering himself, he has to remove himself from Griffith, which causes the trauma that unlocks this theme in Griffith. And so it is, again, this move from Guts' humanity and free will starts to feel like fate. And it's like, as much as I bat those ideas back and forth around in my head as I analyze this story and read it over and over, it doesn't come down on either side. You can't go, this is a story of fate or this is a story of free will. It's this weird intermingling, and I think this is true of all the great tragedies, where human nature is both so frail and contingent and also so set in stone, and there's something scary and beautiful about it.
Yeah, well, because part of like that thing of the notion of fate is it's so much of like these experiences that these people have had will define the choices that they make and the behavior that they have, right? And so it is like, because of these experiences, because of what they have gone through, they're sort of caged in that, like, while they technically may have decisions, they themselves cannot bring themselves to make any choice but the one that those experiences lead them to. And that's where I think part of the interplay with Griffith and Guts is really powerful, is because it feels to me like Guts is a person who is able to grow and change. And if there's anyone who represents the power of human free will and that like ability to overcome those environmental factors and grow beyond them, it would be Guts, someone who sort of like ascends beyond the position he initially has, who's not satisfied in the kind of the box or the cage he has been given, and eventually grows beyond it and goes free. Whereas Griffith is still stuck there, and he is like the experiences that he has had, he can't bring himself to go beyond that kind of like framework he has, and he can't kind of grow beyond whatever that point is. And so that is where he is stuck making these like horrendous choices. Because obviously like the truly critical choice that Griffith makes, and maybe we should just like dive into this whole like scene, because to me it's the best thing, maybe like the best moment in all of Berserk is the confrontation between Guts and Griffith when Guts chooses to walk away. But that happens, and then the immediate thing that Griffith does is he goes to seduce/assault Charlotte, Princess Charlotte, right? And that is the critical choice he makes, that is the mistake. But it's also the mistake that he feels destined to make by all of these separate factors having built up, right? But that moment, that is to me just like the thing in Berserk. I just remember reading the manga and getting to that scene in that sequence and those two juxtaposed moments of the duel and then the assault, and just being blown away by how powerful a piece of storytelling it is. And it's equally true in the anime. Like, that episode is so incredible. But it is this like moment of such powerful insight into Griffith as a person, because you are given this brief moment of interiority with Griffith, that usually he's a character that is at arm's length, that you are always kind of in Guts' head and Guts' POV. But in this moment where you get the recapitulation of the duel, this time because Guts is choosing to leave, not because he's trying not to join, and you get then that whole duel from Griffith's point of view, that he's thinking, like, this is what I have to do. I deflect his sword, and then I go and I stab him in the shoulder, and I'll have to be careful, because if I am a little bit off, I'm going to kill him. But he's like kind of like resigns himself to, if that's what it takes, I would rather take Guts' life than willingly let him go, which is a very Griffith way to see the world. But like in Griffith's head, he's got this whole thing settled, and he goes in and he's going to do his little parry and all that shit. And Guts comes down and he slices through that sword like a piece of fucking butter and then stops the sword immediately, right? Like, there is such clarity and power to Guts in that moment, where it's so clear how far beyond Griffith he has grown, that it's not even a contest. It's not a fucking duel. It is Guts. He is just leaving. And like the amount of control you just see expressed in Guts, that all he does is cut the sword and nothing else and walks away like it's trivial. It is such a powerful moment of seeing that, like, all these little things that Guts has done, like killing 100 people in one night, which is fucking such a wild part of the story, but to make that feel somehow believable, and yet Guts does it. He has really grown as a person, whereas Griffith is the same now as he has always kind of like been since we have known him, and he's not really grown, he's not really evolved. So of course Guts is able to go past this. And you have that moment, and then you cut to Griffith deciding to sneak in and have sex with Princess Charlotte. Obviously, like, broadly speaking, his plan has been to eventually marry Princess Charlotte in order to become heir to the throne of Midland, is obviously what his kind of implied plan is. But here, that choice, I think, is so powerful because you don't get any narration from Griffith. He's not explaining this decision to you. And this is one of those things of just like the power of storytelling, that everything about why he is making this incredible choice to go and have sex with the princess of this kingdom, kind of seemingly out of nowhere, all of the meaning of that is expressed purely through the juxtaposition of what has just happened before, which is him losing that duel, and then he goes and does this. And so all of this like romantic sexual energy that he has for Guts, that sense of impotency he feels at not being able to control or dominate Guts anymore, all of that frustration and sexual everything in there, he expresses by violently putting it upon this like woman whom he knows is going to be willing. That also is a way for him to just like debase and disgrace these like systems of power and things that have control over him, this like that create the cage that he has to live within, that Guts has just fucking busted his way through and walked away because he doesn't give a shit about any of it. And yet Griffith is here having to dance this dance and sing this song in order to pursue this dream, and in order to just basically spit on all of that and to let all of that emotion out, he makes this horrifying choice to go sleep with this girl. That then, of course, is the thing that will get discovered, and then he gets captured and thrown in the fucking torture hole and all this shit. And it is both like it feels like a choice that Griffith is actively making, and yet at the same time, in that tragedy way, it feels inevitable because of the person he is, the experiences he has had, and his inability to kind of his lack of sort of self-insight. And his lack of curiosity about his own nature, Whereas like Guts is very curious about himself and is very interested in exploring who he is and what he is as a person. Griffith never seemingly really does that. That dooms him to this moment and this fate. Whereas Nosferatu Zod tells us at their first duel that the thing that will awaken the Behelit is the moment when all of Griffith's dreams and ambitions are shattered. And this is the thing that leads to that.
Yes, very good breakdown of, I agree, you know, the most pivotal part of this story. I think, so that's episode 19. I think that sequence on the snowy hill where they have their final duel is the best directed sequence of Berserk 97. And it's got competition. There's lots of other good scenes. But like, I think, and also, I mean, it's very close to the manga. That is also one of the best set of pages Miura ever drew. It follows that progression very clearly down to the whole thing that I feel like almost like Miura drew thinking about an anime adaptation one day, which is the detail that right before they swing their swords, snow falls off the branch of the tree, and then they go, which is, I mean, that's such a Kurosawa, like, samurai standoff thing to do. But like that whole progression, it's such a good translation of manga pages to anime storyboards and composition. It's very teachable, I think, in that way too. But also that they include all that in one episode, because they have to cut down some stuff to make it work, but it is so worth it, because I think it would be wrong for those events to happen in different episodes. You have to have Guts choosing to leave, and like starting his journey, and then Griffith. It's also because also it's that Casca, her role in this is also crucial, because she goes and gets Griffith and brings him there to try to stop Guts, which is part of the tragedy, but also makes total sense because Casca can't. Her line later on, when she right before she and Guts have sex, as she expresses this thing of like, I can't change. She feels like she wants to change and she can't. And I think she's not giving herself credit for how much she has, but also her problem is her inability to, like, part of it is leave her, like, girlish fantasy for Griffith and embrace this very real thing she's found with Guts. That's part of what I think she's thinking about then.
Yes.
Because what she actually needs to do is not go and yell to Griffith to stop this. She needs to go talk to Guts and be like, I love you, let's figure this out, right? Because Guts at this point, I think, would be responsive to that. He's a very mature person at this point in the story. And so that's part of it, too. But you have that, and then you have to also end the episode with Griffith making that choice and doing what he does with Princess Charlotte. And it requires them making some excisions, like in this conversation where Guts is with Corcus and Judo, there's a much longer explanation of what you were just saying, Sean, that like where Judo goes through and lays out how clearly not just marrying Princess Charlotte has been his plan, but that all of the assassinations he's had Guts carry out, which Judo kind of winks at, like, I know you did that, Guts, was part of it too. That, like, getting rid of Count Julius got rid of the next heir. Getting rid of the queen and all of the counselors got rid of all the conservatives in the court who would never allow Charlotte to marry a commoner. And so, you know, and in the manga, what it's trying to emphasize is that, like Griffith is within inches of his goal. He is almost there. He is at the 1 yard line. He is right there about to win. And that is when he messes up. And so they have to reduce some of that exposition to get it all in one episode. But it is so worth it. Because as you're saying, Sean, it's the juxtaposition that is so powerful. And, you know, it also gets rid of, like, the sex is much more explicit in the manga. I think the manga toes that line of, is it an assault? Is it consensual? It is, because it's able to be sexually explicit, it plays with that back and forth a little bit more. But again, for a 25-minute episode of anime, it is the perfect adaptation in getting everything you need in that one episode so that you feel the juxtaposition as powerfully as possible.
Yes, and if we could travel back in time and show Sigmund Freud one episode of anime, this would be the episode show. Is like, look at the swords and what happens with the swords. You want your phallic imagery? Well, look at Guts' sword and look what he does to Griffith's sword and look what Griffith chooses to do immediately after. You know, I think Freud would have a lot to write about if he saw episode 19 of Berserk.
Well, it's because, you know, Griffith, it is this idea of control, right? And Griffith is so good at controlling so many things. I mean, he has played a shit hand where he's born a commoner in the streets, and he has come, again, inches from parlaying that into, I'm going to be the future king of this fucking kingdom. He has played his hand so phenomenally. He is a genius at strategy. All of these things he commands loyalty of thousands of men with like almost no effort. All of this stuff, he's a genius at it. And there's this one thing he can't control. And this is going to sound cheesy, but it's true. It's his own fucking heart. That's the thing he can't control. It's not actually Guts, it's him. Because any moment he could have the heart-to-heart with Guts and they could figure this shit out if he wanted to. But he doesn't.
Yeah.
And so what he does is he tries to enact that control in microcosm over Charlotte, someone he has already in the palm of his hand. He's going to marry this girl. Like that's written at this point. It's almost inevitable. Yes. But he needs that immediate sexual, physical control to try to fill this void that he cannot actually fill. And again, it is the dumbest thing he could possibly do, and it feels completely inevitable and in character. And being able to write that, again, when I make the Game of Thrones comparison, it's like if you plot all storytelling out on a line from greatest to worst. The Daenerys turn at the end of season 8 of Game of Thrones is on the bad end, and the Griffith turn in Berserk, this version, the manga, is over here on the good end. And it's like, it's the same idea, basically, but done diametrically opposite in terms of quality.
Yeah, it also just talked about like how effectively you're using sex as a storytelling device. We talked about that the manga has the sex scene between Guts and Casca. That obviously is very abbreviated in the anime, but it's still a very powerful example of sex as this positive force in both their lives. And here it is being wielded as a weapon by Griffith, just as like in a kind of now in a dominant way, in the way that he had used it submissively with that count, but I think both as a way to punish himself for letting that one kid die in the battle. But he's also, he has this justification he gives to himself about it being for money. Obviously, I think it traumatizes him and affects him in this very deep way, but it is him self-flagellating by giving his body to this disgusting man. But it is also a thing he can justify with the money part of it, whereas here, now it is just so purely, there's no excuse he can fall back on. Like, you see how empty and kind of like depleted Griffith is the next morning, that like this experience gave him nothing. It benefited him in no way. Like, it didn't actually fulfill the thing that he needed, because of course it didn't, because the thing he needs has nothing to do with Princess Charlotte. And it doesn't matter that he's a day away from, potentially being able to, curry this with the king and start laying the like specific plans for that, a kind of actual political marriage. Even if that political marriage went through, it would not give Griffith the things that he needs, because the thing he needs is Guts. He needs someone he trusts and actually cares about. There's another like critical moment here. This is more an misunderstanding from Guts's perspective earlier in the series, where you have that thing where they're at the party and Griffith has taken Princess Charlotte aside to like the fountain, and Guts overhears that conversation he has about like what a true friend is, right? That's like, oh, all those men are my like comrades at arms. But a true friend is someone who is an equal, who like, has their own dream, right? And isn't just giving themselves up to somebody else. And Guts overhears that and his whole world kind of shatters. And it's the moment that he kind of begins questioning himself, realizing that what he is doing with Griffith is not different than what he's been doing the whole rest of his life. The only difference is that Griffith is way better to him than all these other people that have told him who to kill. But he's still in a situation where there's someone just pointing him at people and telling him, go kill those people. And he goes and does it, including going and killing the kid, not intentionally, but killing that kid of the prince, right? And all that shit that really horrifies Guts. That I think is one of those other pieces that starts leading him to realizing that he needs to grow and change and evolve. But my reading of that scene has always been that in Griffith's eyes, Guts is an equal. Like, I don't think Griffith thinks of Guts in the way that he's talking about in that moment. And Guts is interpreting it as like, oh, this like, I'm so much lesser than him. But I do think that Guts is like the only person we ever see that Griffith trusts, right? It's why he goes to Guts and has him do the assassinations, even if objectively speaking,
Guts is the wrong like person for that.
Person.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, yeah, he's gonna fucking kill the dude. Clearly that guy's gonna die. You tell Guts to kill a motherfucker, that dude's not gonna live. But you've got Judo who can he's like the Hawkeye of the fucking Band of the Hawks. He can hit anything with a throwing knife and all this shit. Like, why would you get the fucking 6'5" mountain of fucking muscle with a sword the size of his own body who fucking cleaves horses in two? is just not the guy you get for the surreptitious court assassination. It's just wrong. But he's the only person that Griffith actually trusts. And I just don't, it's hard for me to see that as anything other than Griffith deep down really understands and sees Guts as an equal. Is the only person he really sees Guts as an equal. And he's like, he's afraid of that, and so he's desperate to be able to control Guts while he feels bad about controlling him, right? You get multiple moments involving these different court assassinations where he's very apologetic to Guts, which Guts kinds of dismisses a little bit, but I think for Griffith it's very heartfelt, where he's like, don't you see me as a villain? Don't you think of me as being awful for like controlling you and manipulating you in these ways? And I just don't think Griffith would ever say that to someone unless he did really see them as someone on his own level, and maybe the only person in his life he's ever seen on that level. And so that's, for me, another one of those critical misunderstandings, is that Guts overhears that and sees himself in that conversation and gets like deep insight, even though I think if he had talked it out with Griffith, he maybe would realize that that's not what Griffith ever really meant. And that's, I think, what he starts to kind of piece together later on when Casca's telling him more about what Griffith has gone through and all these things, and he's starting to wonder how culpable is he for the choices Griffith has made. I think he only then starts to realize just how important he is, and that maybe he did always sit in that definition of true friend that Griffith has for himself. But obviously he realizes this far too late for it to matter.
Yes, and that is episode 10 in the anime, and I remember vividly the first time I watched through this show. I mean, I was taken with it from the word go, because it's incredible, but that is the episode where I fell in love with Berserk, because it is that 1-2 punch of Guts goes in and does the assassination and kills the nobleman Julius and then kills the kid. And you're like, oh my God, Guts, because Guts is such a lovable character. It's so weird to say if you've only seen like his picture with the giant sword and you're like, that guy? I'm like, no, that guy is like the most lovable, sweet boy that I want to protect. And I hate that this has happened to him. But it is that. And then again, you have to have these things in the same episode. The juxtaposition of him overhearing that, feeling so low, the blocking of that scene. And this is all from the manga, but of Griffith at the top of the staircase, Guts and Casca at the bottom, that void they see between them. In the manga, it's this just black page with a white outline at the top and bottom. And then for the anime, they do one of their sort of like postcard moments and a pan on it, and it's beautiful. But it's brilliant. And that episode is called To Tokimono, which I think in the Discotheque translation, they just translate that as nobleman, which is one of the meanings of that word, but that word also just means like a precious thing.
Yes.
And obviously it is a double meaning. It is both that there is a noble person here that Guts kills, there's a noble person in the form of Griffith, and there is a precious thing between them. And what is that? And of course to Griffith, like that's also my kind of read on that scene, Sean, is when Griffith is saying all that, I think he's talking about Guts. I think Guts is like the first person he's maybe ever thought that about, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And it's yeah, like, because that is like a really fascinating title, To Tokimono, because it's like, because it is both like, it can mean noble, it can also mean like precious, it's like, but also kind of can mean something that's like out of reach, that's like exalted, that's higher.
Yes.
Like there's a lot of meaning in like totoi, that adjective. Or if you want the baby-fied version of it that is used in a VTuber culture, here's a fucking weird Japanese lesson, but the word te, if you watch a lot of like modern Japanese internet videos, that's like a slang term that is like this very baby-fied version of totoi, but that is that like, it can mean that sense of like precious, both in like literally it is precious, but also that like, oh, how precious, right? It's all those things. And so, yeah, it is definitely like a very loaded title that is, it's a fucking perfect title for the episode. I wonder if that is maybe a title of one of the chapters, because it just feels so fucking loaded.
I believe it is, because I think most of the episode titles come from chapters. Obviously, there's many, many more chapter titles, but I think they usually pick one from a chapter in that like run of the manga they're doing. And the chapter titles are also very, very good. Something I appreciate about the Dark Horse manga translation is that they leave all the Japanese titles on there as well, so you can still see them, and it's kind of cool to compare that. They leave all the sound effects intact too, which is the way God intended. But anyway, yeah, so, because there is, the structure of this thing is so elegant, Sean, because you have basically three important Guts-Griffith confrontations, which is the first duel they have where Guts is claimed by Griffith. You have the final duel where Guts is freed, and you have that middle, and it's literally like right in the middle. This episode's 2, 10, 19, where they don't know Griffith doesn't know that Guts is there, but Guts sees Griffith and hears this thing. And again, and I think you can also see that with Casca, where there's like an early story with Casca and her frustration with Guts. Then there is their middle story where you have the 100-man duel and all of that stuff. And then there is the kind of finale where they come back together when he rejoins the Band of the Hawk and they have sex and they become a couple, basically. Like the show is so good at these structures of growing those characters and those relationships over time.
Yeah, it's so perfectly paced, and it is just that sense of that slow, like, kind of joy at seeing Guts grow and change, because he does like that just power of one of like the other best episodes, episode 14, Campfire of Dreams, but that power of him having this revelation that he has off screen, right? Like you don't see him make this decision. You don't see him like sit down and talk to himself or have like a monologue about it, right? He has clearly over the course of things, since hearing like it's, I think clearly the Totokimono, all the stuff that happened in that Nobleman episode is kind of this inciting incident. And then you have all the stuff of that big battle and all the shit that goes down. He kills the 100 men. And then you have that beautiful, beautiful scene. This is probably like the best art in the whole anime. Just of them on the hill and the campfire, the campfires below that they're looking at, like it's, like their lights, just like illuminating the night. It's so gorgeous. The backgrounds are so beautiful. And you get that one like just incredible choral song that plays at this scene. And it is Guts kind of laying this out, and Casca under like having the insight to see, okay, like he is going to leave. Like they're sitting there talking about dreams and what has united all of them and all of this stuff. But Guts has clearly come to this conclusion that he has to go. He's going to stick around for that one last big battle, but after that he needs to go off on his own. And just like the power of that moment of this guy you have seen who has just been defined so much by being this naked sword who just kills anybody around him. He is so raw and brutal when you first meet him as this little kid, to slowly becoming this person that everybody at the Band of the Hawk trusts, and maybe in ways like much more deeper than they do with Griffith, because he's there with them. He's there with the men, right? You see this incredible rapport he has with all of them, and yet like also now he must finally go off and really discover who he is. Because all of these moments have helped him really process the trauma and everything he has gone through, to the point that he can actually go on this journey of self-exploration that is also very like tied into, I think, all of the like, there's this kind of martial artist component to it as well, that it's like, everything he has done, he has lived by the sword, and the sword is the only thing he knows. And there is this kind of simple level of kind of purity and enlightenment that maybe that's this kind of brought him to, that is about like refining this one part of himself, and that giving him insight into everything about his life. But the way that conversation happens, the music, the imagery, and just how moving it is to see this person that you have come to care about so much, see that he is so much more important and the world is so much more bigger than anything he's seen before, and his courage in going out to embrace that. It's just such a beautiful moment. It's beautiful in the manga as well, but it's one place where I think like the anime is just like 11 out of 10 and using all the different tools it has to bring that specific scene to life.
And it is doing it through the style of, we already talked about this a little bit, but lest it go unsaid, limited animation. We've talked about that a couple times this season in the Dororo episodes, and then in the Anime Rama trilogy episodes, particularly where Belladonna of Sadness is concerned. And I said at that time, like, we're going to see another of the masterpieces of limited animation at the end of this season, and I meant Berserk, because this is. And it's such a great example of something where, and I've tried to make this point when I've taught this concept to students and everything, of disaggregate limited from cheap. Sometimes there is a relationship. Like, Dororo looks the way it looks in part because it is a 60s anime that didn't have a ton of resources behind it. And you can tell that in some parts, right? Like when the background, loops or something. But also, there is a very clear artistic aspect to that in Dororo, where, like, particularly in the Dezaki episodes, like, boy, there is such intention with how it is using those resources. So you have to disaggregate these things. And I think Berserk is another beautiful example of this, where I don't think Berserk ever feels cheap to me. Like, obviously, it has limitations that lead to some of these, uses of techniques, but it's so purposeful, it feels like one of the most aesthetically rich anime I have ever seen. And it is because it has such a full-throated understanding of what limited animation can be as an artistic tool, in that, like, yeah, you could try to draw this battle scene with a ton of movement and a ton of characters on screen, but you don't have the resources or time for that. So you could make a shitty version of it, or you could go with a Dezaki-style postcard moment and have the most gorgeous image on screen that, by the way, really replicates the power of the single image that Miura uses, because Miura is a mangaka who really emphasizes single pages, full panels, big splash pages, and so the pace of how he thinks through images is very similar to how an anime that is using limited animation thinks through images and editing and all of that stuff. And so when you look at it, none of those moments feel like cut corners. They feel like the right artistic representation of this idea. And I think on to today, like, yes, if you wanted to do the version of Berserk that has a shit ton of movement and a shit ton of bodies on screen, probably some kind of 3D CG base is the only way to practically do that. But I think that's the wrong call. I just think that's just flat out, no matter how good the 3D CG is, I think it's the wrong call. I think they had the right call in 97, is that you go smaller, not bigger, and you replicate what the manga is doing in this form, a form that is endemic to anime as a medium. You're not, skimping. You're not running from it. You're embracing something really beautiful, and this show is just tremendous at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I echo all of that. That it is like that Dezaki Osamu style that this show is so very clearly going for in kind of every single dimension of its production just fits Berserk so perfectly. Like, it's just because you do want that postcard memory idea of these incredibly beautiful, very stylized but very detailed images, and then I think they use them well, because kind of, the thing with the postcard memory is also that it's not just here is a like still frame, it's you're also using camera movement and maybe like some like lens effects on top of it to like sell all those elements as well. It's just like, it's such a great use of that technique to, as you say, like kind of bring some of that energy that the manga has into the anime, because a lot of those kind of big battle scenes in the manga are not about like showing you lots of like individual detail of individual moments of the fight. It's about the overall impression of this giant skirmish, and then it will zoom in if it's something that wants to spend more time on, just this fight happens, which sometimes it will do that. You will then zoom on and here is like what Guts is doing in this battle, and then you have some moments with that. But I think the choices they make in using the limited animation is so effective, and is more effective than if you're trying to do your big 3D CG production, or you're trying to do a Kyoto animation thing and just go fuck it. Like, we're just going to try to make it as smooth and as many frames as we can get and all those kinds of things. Like, that's just not the right style here.
Kyoto Animation's Berserk. Guts' hair has never looked better, blowing in the breeze. Oh my God.
Yeah, it's just, there are lots of things where that kind of very fluid animation style works amazingly. But there are lots of things where it's like the kind of staccato in like raw and brutal image or like style and feeling that this more limited animation can give is way more effective. And the kind of like the high emotions and the very heightened theatrical quality of it, I just think like it's so appropriate here, as it is in like the Dezaki Osamu shows I have seen, where it just feels like I would not want this in a style that has more frames. I'm not rating my animation by how many frames of animation I give it, because if I did, then I would go to all those fucking terrible YouTube videos that's like, Naruto versus Gaara, 120 frames per second, blah, 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 and like, this like, well, this is the greatest anime ever made, because look at all the frames they have AI generated and like interpolated into this bullshit. It's like, no, it's about what is the effect on the overall aesthetic and narrative that this presentation model gives. And just like something like a belladonna of sadness, like I don't need lots and lots and lots of frames for a lot of what that movie depicts. Like I like the shock of the suddenness of the imagery and the power of the single image that you're sitting there taking time to process. That has so much power to it when it's done appropriately, and Berserk constantly does it incredibly, whether it's for the bigger battle scenes and some of those huge moments, like, you know, Griffith chopping a fucking sword in half, or Guts chopping a horse in half. You know, your kind of like big gory moments, or it's your more emotional moments, like in the Campfire of Dreams, and these two people sitting on a hill and seeing this beautiful painting of all the campfire and the lights down at the bottom of the hill. Like it's so good for both of those kinds of registers that Berserk is operating in.
Or here's another really good example: is the Guts Casca sex scene in episode 21, where like it's really, the sex part of it is just one of those postcard memory moments that they do this sort of like pan, like diagonally across, showing their bodies having intercourse. The manga has quite a few more panels. Like when it gets to sex scenes, Miura likes to indulge himself a certain amount. And I think for that scene, it's very justified because of that. And so like you could imagine the version of this where they, you know, animate thrusting and have more sound effects and all of that stuff. But I actually think for an anime, like there's something about just that single image, especially if you're not getting into the other parts of that scene that are in the manga about kind of Guts's traumas and hang-ups around sexual intimacy and all that, that like, that's the exact right call. I think that one image just gives it to you entirely. And also just the reality that probably for content reasons, they could not have done much more than that if they wanted to. You also see in like the rape scene at the end of the show, they don't depict a lot of movement, which I also think would just I saw this. I was going through the Golden Age movies, and they do a much more graphic version of both the sex scene and the rape scene that would be basically happening in film 3. And in both cases, I also think some things read differently when they're in motion than when they are on a manga page, where like technically this is truer to all the stuff you see in the manga, but it feels like more brutal, more leering, more wrong, but not wrong in the sense of like morally wrong, which of course it's supposed to be, but of like, it feels icky. I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but I think holding back sometimes can say a lot more, and this show knows it.
Yeah, I agree. That's like, you know, I think that's like a key thing in depicting like sex, is that it is, you know, like by putting it into motion, you're putting like way more information into the scene. And when you're doing something that can be such a like hot fire thing to depict, like sex, and especially sexual assault, like the economy of information is, I think, very important to think about. And honestly, this can be true for violence very much as well. That having like too much information, too much there ends up sort of like putting too much of a spin on the ball in terms of how the audience is going to receive it. And so when you're doing too much there, there's too much detail on the movement and all that kind of stuff for the sexual assault scene. It is like you're starting to get into the risk of tipping over to the territory of it is exploitative, and feel like it is partially there for titillation, right? That it is there for the like purely for the transgressive nature of it. And there are like other things I have seen, and Game of Thrones is a fucking perfect example for where you can go very much on the wrong side of that line, where it starts feeling like this is serving a cheap narrative purpose of all the purpose of the narrative is that let's make this guy more of a bad guy. And that's all you're doing with it. There's no bigger character arc and like, deeper themes you're exploring like Berserk does. But then also it feels like it is there, I wish I could come up with a more elegant way to say this, but I just can't. It feels like it's there for sickos to get off to.
Right? You're right about that. Yes.
Right. Yeah, like that's not. If I was writing an academic essay breaking this down, I'd try to find like a better way to explore that idea. But that's, even if it's not the intention, it feels like that's where you can go to, and that's one of the things that I'm glad we did Belladonna Sadness in this season. When we're also doing Berserk, because I think Belladonna Sadness is like maybe the best piece of visual media I've seen that has rape and sexual assault as an essential element of what it is. And that's another instance where it's like being very thoughtful about how you're presenting this information to the audience is super critical. And even you don't even have to go to Belladonna Sadness. You can do the sex scenes in 1001 Nights, like the Sugi Gizaburo one at the middle of that movie when they're on the basically the Siren Island or whatever the creatures are. But it's that where it becomes totally abstract. And there it's like, it's erotic without being pornographic in any way. It doesn't feel like the scene is like titillating and meant to arouse the audience. Instead, it is meant to make you like more kind of spiritually engage with the notion of what sex is, of this intermingling of two people and their bodies. And here I think Berserk, by using the limited animation techniques, or like, in the manga, and I think like the manga is not always on the perfect side of this. I think like it can do it incredibly well. I think sometimes it doesn't do it as well. And the anime, by cutting out a lot of that stuff, just has a lot less of it. And also by it being much shorter, right? Because Berserk goes on. There's different elements of this later in the series as well. But when Berserk does it really well, which oftentimes it does do it really well, it is expressing it in a very particular manner with a very like particular frame. And I think the anime figures out how to use the limited animation techniques to do the same thing. And so it's showing you this scene of Casca and Guts having sex in their intimacy, but it's not doing it for you to get off to. It's doing it as a culmination of these character arcs. And so having this single powerful image of the intertwining of their bodies and their hands as they're coming together in this very equal moment where neither of them is dominating the other, like that is there to make you feel that the full catharsis of these two people who have been spiraling around each other, like kind of for most of their lives at this point, and just missing each other, not quite getting there. And then finally they have connected after years and years, and after like the whole big time jump, they're finally together. And presenting that in that one single image is so much more powerful than having your 90-second explicit sex scene. And then even more powerfully for me is like showing how much emphasis there is on like their nudity afterwards, of the two of them standing in the forest naked together, embracing and talking. And that's where, Guts has his line about like, I haven't held you enough. I want to hold. This is where like you also have to get the translation thing. I haven't held you or like made love to you. I want to make love to you 100, 1,000 times more. That's where you need to also keep in mind that the Japanese word daku, the verb, can mean to hold, hug, or embrace. It can also mean to have sex or make love to. And so there is like, it is both of those things. I want to embrace you and I want to have sex with you. And those are two kind of combined ideas here. But I want that and you and us together to be a fundamental part of my life now. Like that, the frankness and the nudity and the natural landscape in that state says and communicates so much without ever this all stepping over the line into feeling like it is just there for you to like go look up on, the internet, you're like super cut of all the fucking sex scenes of Berserk for you to jerk off to. Like, it's just not that kind of show. There are other shows that can be like that, and that can be fine for those shows, but that's not what Berserk is. It's not what the manga is like. I'm very glad that that's, because the anime very easily could end up like that, and I think the show shows a lot of skill in not getting into that territory.
Yes. And, sex is just a difficult thing to depict in any kind of media, and there's lots of conversations around it. Berserk is really interesting when it comes to this and to the sexual assault side of it. Miura himself has said in interviews that he thinks the early years of Berserk had too much sexual assault. So, like, he is aware of that problem. It is a problem in the manga, where I think there are scenes that deal with it extremely maturely and in a way that I think is very key to the story. And I would say the entire arc of Guts having been raped as a child does that really well. I think the climax of the Eclipse thing being Femto raping Casca is also something that like clearly has been seeded in the narrative in such a way that like it's brutal, but it is saying something about like trauma and these cycles. And it's like the way the story ultimately damns Griffith is with this final transgression and all of that kind of stuff. There are other parts, like the character Wild, who Guts fights, is like introduced raping a whole harem of women, and it's awful, and some of that stuff is bad. But like I think the show also is good in taking the best parts of the manga there and focusing them down and doing them in a way that feels right for the animated medium. And I think that includes the rape at the end of the show with Femto and Casca, where I think it shows enough to be very clear-eyed about the trauma, about the vindictive, awful way Griffith is doing it, about the way it is traumatizing for both Casca and for Guts, while not forgetting that this is being done to Casca. But it also doesn't feel like it's reveling in it or trying to, be something that sickos are going to get off to, right? And I think they find that balance well, where it is, I think it leaves you with the impression it needs to leave you with, which is, I need to go stare at the wall for a while and think about the world, because that's the end of Berserk, the show,
Yeah, because it is the ultimate culmination of, I think, this element of Berserk, which is you are experiencing a story of people who have experienced intense abuse and trauma that has defined their life in so many ways, and all of them are trying to find a way to escape and go beyond that trauma. And that's where seeing that growth of Guts, of him realizing that he is willingly living in someone else's cage because he just can't envision a life for himself, because he feels he's like dirty. He feels like he has no purpose or nothing good he can contribute to the world, and him growing beyond that mindset is so satisfying and so powerful. And yet, then it also then leads him to the point of kind of seeing how the whole world is built by people like the people who abused him. And that the people who are abused, they can then themselves become abusers in order to try to cope with that, which is part of what you see in Griffith's arc. And so much of the larger story of Berserk past that point then becomes about Guts trying to figure out how to live in that world once he sees that the world is built by those kinds of people. Maybe a relevant feeling storyline.
Yes.
The President of the United States is a rapist. It's relevant anyways, because it's just generally true about the people in power, whether they're literally rapists or it's whatever other kinds of abuses of power they engage in. But that's that larger story that Berserk later gets into. But for the purposes of this anime, I do think it's just an incredibly powerful and feels brutal but poignant moment to show how there are some people like Guts and Casca who have been able to kind of use this abuse for themselves to motivate themselves and bring themselves out of that cycle into being stronger, better people. And kind of trying to break through it. And then you also see someone like Griffith who cannot bring himself to do it, who still uses sex as a dominating tool. And it's what he used it for with Charlotte. And then it's what he's using it for with Casca. And it's all about domination, right? And it's all about the violence and the control of it. There's no point where I don't, again, my read of the character is that he's gay. I don't think he's even sexually attracted to Charlotte or Casca. I just don't think that's in Griffith. I think he is in love with Guts completely, and he is using this as a tool he's physically and sexually dominating Casca in that moment, but he's doing it also to dominate and control Guts, this person who he feels has spited him by trying to leave that control. And it is, I think so telling that the story here, it is about Griffith, it's about his literal apotheosis, right? It's about him literally becoming a god/devil, right? Ascending to a being of a higher plane. There's a lot of later stuff in Berserk that's all about how these beings cannot physically incarnate in our universe because they exist on a different plane of existence, and all this shit of trying to get them physically embodied on the mortal realm is a whole concern. That's the level of entity Griffith has ascended to. And what's the first thing he does when he ascends to literal godhood? It is to rape a woman in order to express domination over him and Guts, the only two people who actually fucking cared about him. And it's the level of pettiness you see there, I think, is part of the thing that's so powerful, is this profound juxtaposition of the most insane Lovecraftian demonic bullshit you've ever seen, but that also it all boils down to the most pettily, vindictive, gross thing he can think of to do. What's the most simply transgressive action that Griffith can come up with in that moment? It's to rape Casca in front of Guts. And that's the thing he does. And I just think there's something about that's what the evil is in this world, is people who use their power in this petty, disgusting way. And it boils down to that, and that's what the devil is. That's what the demon is. That it's all about that power and control on this very simple level. And that's where I think that, like, on paper, there's so many things where if you just, like, spelled out what is happening in that scene, I think it'd be very easy to dismiss it as being your really bad examples of rape being used as, like, a thing to just sort of, like, make the bad guy seem like more of a bad guy, which is obviously a big issue that a lot of this genre has. And on paper, it almost kind of looks like that. But then when you see it in execution, whether it's in the manga or the anime, like, every time I've experienced the story, I've been taken aback by how kind of powerful it feels on a narrative level, and how much of it is an example of how you can use this material in a story without it tipping its way over into this, like, into the more disgusting version of it that if you want to see, you can watch a Game of Thrones or whatever. There's plenty of examples of it being done poorly. There are precious few examples of it being done well, in my opinion.
I completely agree, and both the manga and the anime do that very well. There's this line, it's in the manga, it's repeated in the anime, right before Griffith awakens as Femto, where he's in this, like, we see his interiority, he's in this interior state, he sees this droplet, and he says, "What's this?" And the voice, I think it's the Void, tells him, "This is the crystallization of your last tear shed." And then it says this line that is such a powerful encapsulation of the dark kind of trauma you're talking about, Sean. Not that all trauma is dark, but the Griffith way of giving into it, where it says, "When suffering so profound as to make someone rip himself apart is confronted, a heart is frozen." And it goes on to explain that is what he is becoming. He is becoming this thing where he is being frozen in the moment of him tearing himself apart. That idea that Zod gives you of the ambitions collapsing and the trauma overtaking him, and now that is the entirety of what you are forever. And there's even more dialogue in the manga, I think, about that, about how he will become this infinite being of evil and all this stuff. And it is such a powerful idea of that. And it is also why I think the ending, of the anime choosing to stop where it stops and creating this kind of Mobius strip is so right for the story they're telling, where there is something so brutally honest about not going on and depicting the last couple bits of the Golden Age where, like, everything's shit, but, at least Guts has the Dragon Slayer and he's going out to hunt some demons and maybe there's a tomorrow. And there's something about, like, if this is the story we're telling, it's kind of more honest to just get to that point of ultimate trauma and then let it freeze in place. It is astonishing. It's harrowing. It's troubling, but it is the right ending.
Yeah, and then as you have the Mobius strip effect of where you see Guts, what he has become in the immediate aftermath of that, where he has kind of regressed as a person. He has become, like, the really brutally violent person you see at the very beginning of the manga or in episode 1. And then, how that, like, abuse and trauma has been re-inflicted. Obviously Guts is using that violence, broadly speaking, he's trying to kill demons, but you also see him just, like, brutally fuck up all those guys at the tavern. Like, they're all assholes. But he's, like, there is a cruelty to Guts in episode 1 that you do not see in the rest of the show. And so while the manga again then goes on to, like, Guts struggling with that anger and struggling, like, this is, like, a big part of what the whole Berserker armor eventually comes about from. It's like, where and how is it appropriate to use this anger, and where and how is it not appropriate? And how is this, like, anger and rage and fury, how is it dominating my life, and how can I cope with it? Like, that becomes a big part of the story. But that's a scope that this single show can't deal with. So yeah, having it just stop there and, making an artistic statement purely about the abuse and the cycle of this abuse and what it does, even to someone like Guts, who had managed to grow and had managed to seemingly nearly escape its influence, and then it, like, drags him back in because of what Griffith does. It's brutal, it's upsetting, but it's a powerful thematic statement.
Absolutely. And, the whole depiction of the eclipse in this show is just so tremendously powerful.
Oh my
They
God.
do a great job in those last 2 episodes. And again, like, the sheer scale of the imagery in the manga, they can't really reach at because, again, Miura is a madman in how he draws all of this stuff. But boy, I think as particularly getting the color work right in that section with the deep reds and blacks and all of that stuff, it is harrowing. The way they do the first half of episode 25, the finale, is just that one long scene of basically all of the Band of the Hawk getting killed. And it is true to the manga, but it's driven by this track. And on the soundtrack to the show you hear bits of it in other episodes, but it's a track called Murder, and it is like 11 minutes long, and it seemingly was written for episode 25 because they just play that track in its entirety. It's one of the only parts of Berserk where music plays for more than a couple of minutes, and it is just that whole first half of that episode of as the jaws come down on everybody and everybody starts getting attacked, and you have to watch all your favorite characters die. Particularly both the manga and the show know that Judo is everyone's favorite, so they spend the most time with poor Judo, and it is brutal and it is sad. But God, they just do a phenomenal job with all of that, which is a tall order because that section of the manga is next level.
Yeah, and it's that like fucking how insane it is, because yes, you have some demon stuff early on, and then you do get, especially in the manga, you get some more of like, okay, there's some demonic shit happening, but you have the big moment where you first encounter Nosferatu Zod, and you're like, okay, there is some fucking insane shit going on here. This is fucking crazy. I always love the moment where fucking Zod is overlooking that huge battle and Guts' sword breaks. He just fucking picks up the like cleaver looking thing and just chucks it like from a mountain away. It's fucking crazy. It's fucking Nosferatu Zod. What a fucking crazy character that guy is. So you've got a little bit of that demon stuff that's happening, but then you just go so far off the deep end when the eclipse and the ritual happens. And yeah, it's just, we were saying earlier about the variety of art that you get from Miura in terms of like the character designs, that is like plus a million when he gets the monsters involved, because there's just so many unique designs of monsters in that one scene. It's not just like, here's like a couple and we've just kind of reused them over and over. All of them are these like totally bespoke, insane monstrosities, in that very Hieronymus Bosch, the Garden of Earthly Pleasures way of like looking at like, that one part of the triptych that depicts hell. It just tried to spot what's all like the insane fucking creatures you can spot, and all of them are different. Here's a little like fishman dude, here's like the big egg guy, all that shit. Which if you want to see that, you could also play Metaphor Refantasia, which, obviously uses all those designs. But man, like the just amount of horrifying creativity on display with all those creatures, and you've got the one that's like the anglerfish with the naked woman that Corcus like just loses his mind and like embraces, and then obviously he gets kind of eaten off screen. You've got them like dancing all the corpses in front of fucking Guts, and they're like dangling on wires and shit. It's just it's nasty, but it's such powerfully evocative imagery of hell. And I've just always been really fascinated by that very like Renaissance Catholic hell paintings and stuff like that this is very clearly like Miura was drawing inspiration from. And it's such a powerful way of depicting the idea of hell and of demons and of like evil in this way that sort of transcends human understanding. And yeah, the anime translates that to its animated form remarkably well. Even if it's not always the most pleasant thing to watch, but it's very artistically powerful.
Yeah, I was even more impressed with those episodes after having read the manga to see like how much of it they were able to get within the show's style, but also like feeling like it is a break in style because it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be like this is the implosion of the dark fantasy into a world that was touched by it before, but it was not the totality of the world, and now in these two episodes it is. Just does that phenomenally. That whole closing stretch, I think, is great. Those last 6 episodes, it kind of blows my mind because, again, they are running through like 5 volumes of manga in 6 episodes. That shouldn't work, and it feels so elegant. One of the things they do that I actually think is a pretty substantial improvement on what the manga does there is that they go from episode 19 ends with Griffith being arrested. And then you stay in Guts' POV, and episode 20 is him up on the mountain with Godot, the blacksmith, and his like granddaughter Eliza. And you have that, and you have Guts' whole kind of like hermit on a mountain coming to his enlightenment moment under the waterfall and all of that. And then he learns about the Band of the Hawk, and he goes and rejoins them. In the manga, the way that works is first you spend several chapters with Griffith getting arrested, and you have the first scenes of him getting tortured and all of that. Then you see the Band of the Hawk getting hunted. Then you jump forward a year and go to Guts, but the scene is just Guts at that tournament where he fights the character Silat, who I think becomes bigger later on. And then from there, he learns about the Band of the Hawk. He goes back, and it's not until after the Casca sex scene that you get a flashback filling in what he did in that year, and you meet Godot. And I think one of the things that felt, and maybe it's just because I saw the anime first, but like you don't feel the year-long gap as much in the manga because of the way it does all of that. And I really like sticking with Guts' POV. You feel that he's been away for a while, and then you discover what's happened with the new status quo as Guts does. I just always think that's a good way to tell a story, is to kind of focus on your character, especially if you're going to have a big status quo shift, and help us like discover it through his eyes. And I also think it means that they're able to condense a lot of plot in the anime in that way because they're so able to focus in on Guts' POV. And it just makes those closing episodes very elegant in structure.
Yeah, there is only one issue with that, which there is like a very weird kind of out of sequence moment because of how they move the structure around, where you do get that one sequence with Griffith and the torture and all of that, which is a really powerful scene because they're replicating a lot of what that arc does, where you have this like really powerful imagery of like a totally black image, but just Griffith's head in the like eagle-like or hawk-like
helmet,
like prisoner helmet thing in one corner, and him like looking through and seeing like there's like the mass of flesh that crawls across on the floor, and he sees the vision of the god hand in this gap in the wall and all this stuff. But that's all supposed to happen earlier, and there's just like it's weird that the sequence of like his torture doesn't totally make sense, because at what point does he have all of his limbs like ligaments severed and stuff, which that had not happened yet. So there's like weird gaps in time there a little bit. It's not like a big deal. It was like one of the only places where, because I didn't remember exactly how the manga is structured, but that happened, and it like flashed the thing in my head of like, oh right, yes, okay, some of this stuff is kind of moved around a little bit because the timeline of the torture, like that clearly must have happened a longer period in the past than it's implied by the literal chronological sequence of events you're shown. It's like one of the only times that there's like a little bit of a hitch you can kind of detect because they've moved or changed things in the anime.
Yeah, and I totally see that, but they're also still very clever about where they, like, you don't go back to Griffith and see the torture until Guts has learned about what happened and that Griffith has been captured, and then we get that cut. They do the scene where he sees the image of the God Hand as the cold open to one of the episodes. So again, I just think the way they handle POV there is very well done. And yes, it creates some chronology confusion, but I would ultimately prioritize kind of the narrative POV over that, and I think the show makes the right call there. At least for the show, it works very well. Yeah.
Yes.
What else? Anything else? We've been talking for almost 4 hours about this amazing show. Anything else to say about the Swordwind romance Berserk?
It's a hell of a fucking show. I'm very glad that I finally watched it. Obviously, like, I bought the fucking Blu-ray set, what feels like forever ago.
Yeah.
We were like maybe like a year ago now. And then, you know, obviously we decided to do this for the season, and I had to put it on hold for a long time. But yeah, I mean, it is just a truly, truly remarkable adaptation of a truly remarkable manga.
Yes.
And, you know, I'm definitely going to be getting into the manga. I've already downloaded ROMs of the Dreamcast and PS2 game. I don't know if I will I ended up playing that entire Dororo game and very much enjoyed it, the PS2 Dororo game, Blood Will Tell. I don't know if I will play the entirety of these. They don't seem to have been hugely well received, but I do just love this voice cast so much that I'm very interested to hear more, particularly of Kana Nobutoshi as Guts in some of the later material when he's like, you know, Berserk Guts, right? He's like the fully like realized version of that character. So yes, like I've ended up on the Berserk train again. I'm very happy to be there.
I am too. I'm literally recording this I'm at my parents' house because I'm dog sitting for them, and so I'm not in my usual setup. So I have my laptop up on two of my giant Dark Horse like 3-in-1 volumes of Berserk because I needed something to get my laptop a little higher up for the webcam. And I was like, oh, I've got these giant Berserk volumes lying around that I've been reading because they're amazing. Those if you haven't picked those up and you're reading the English translation, just a general recommendation for people. Those Dark Horse big leather-bound volumes are just incredible and really cool to have. So yes, I am on the Berserk train as well. I'm very glad we were able to finally do an episode paying some tribute to Miura Kentaro, because obviously one of the great losses of the last couple of years. such an immense talent, but so much that he achieved that is worth celebrating. And we're only talking about, kind of one corner of it today, but it's a fucking great corner. And yeah, I think this show is a masterpiece. It's one of my favorites ever made. Probably my favorite thing we've watched this season. It's fantastic. But we're not quite done with the season yet, Sean. We have one more episode to go. And next week, we're coming full circle on our grand tour with a show that isn't much like Berserk at all, although it does have demons in it.
Yes, we are, we're sticking in the demon realm for a while, but it's a much happier, more pleasant version of the demon realm, thankfully. There's some cool bugs you can eat to like heal or fuse or whatever. There's just some goofy dudes down there in the demon realm. If only Guts had been transported to this demon realm, everything would have been different. But yes, we are coming full circle because we're coming back to the world of Dragon Ball. But thank Christ, it's not Dragon Ball GT. No, it is something that if you squint, it looks like Dragon Ball GT, but at its heart is very different. We are going to be talking about Dragon Ball Daima, the brand new or relatively brand new Dragon Ball show that finished airing fairly recently. That is sort of a recapitulation of many of the ideas of Dragon Ball GT. But you can watch our episode to see if we like it more. And that's all I'll say about that.
愛しているだが君が一番大切だから夫婦として